HOA Karen trimmed my trees for her view, so I erased her privacy overnight. I came home that Tuesday afternoon to find my yard completely unrecognizable. The 6 oak trees I had planted with my own hands, trees that had taken 11 years to grow into a full, beautiful canopy, had been brutally hacked down to ugly, jagged stumps. Sawdust covered my lawn like pale snow. My neighbor Linda Marsh, HOA president, block captain, self-appointed queen of Sycamore Ridge, was standing at the property line in a crisp linen blazer, arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who had just done God's work. "You're welcome," she said, without blinking. "Now I can see the lake." That moment cracked something open in me that I didn't know was there. I had spent 3 years swallowing Linda's rules, her fines, her passive-aggressive notes. I had been patient. I had been reasonable. But standing there staring at the butchered stumps of my trees, I made a quiet, absolute decision. This ends on my terms. My name is Daniel Reyes. I moved to Sycamore Ridge 6 years ago with my wife, Maya, and our daughter, Sophia, who was 5 at the time. I chose this neighborhood specifically for those trees, for the privacy they provided, for the way they turned the backyard into a world of its own. This house was the first thing I ever truly owned. Maya is a high school art teacher who turns our kitchen into a studio on weekends. Sophia is 11 now, obsessed with marine biology and far too wise for her age. We are not flashy people. We don't throw loud parties or paint our house neon. We mow our lawn, we wave to our neighbors, and we stay in our lane. Or we try to. The irony is that when we first moved in, Linda Marsh brought us a welcome basket. Homemade lemon bars, a copy of the HOA bylaws highlighted in 3 colors, and a smile so wide it looked practiced. I thought she was a little intense, but harmless. I was spectacularly wrong about the harmless part. It started small, the way these things always do. 14 months into living here, Linda knocked on my door holding a printed-out photo of my backyard. She pointed at the oak trees and said they were interfering with the aesthetic continuity of the neighborhood. I told her they were on my property and within HOA guidelines. She smiled tightly. "For now," she said. I didn't know what "for now" meant until 3 weeks later, when I received my first HOA violation notice. 6 pages long, single-spaced. It cited the trees as a visual obstruction creating negative impact on adjacent property values. The citation referenced a bylaw I had never seen, Section 14C, with an amendment dated 2 months prior. An amendment Linda had pushed through at a meeting I hadn't been notified about. I went to the next HOA meeting armed with a copy of the original bylaws and a legal pad full of notes. Linda ran the meeting like a courtroom where she was simultaneously judge, prosecutor, and bailiff. When I raised my hand to speak, she let me wait 11 minutes before acknowledging me. Then she smiled and said, "Daniel, we've already moved past that agenda item." I filed a formal objection in writing the next day. Linda responded with a second violation notice, this one for the height of my mailbox post. 3/4 of an inch too tall, she claimed. I measured it myself, it was exactly regulation. She sent a third notice anyway, citing unresolved prior violations. I was being buried in paper as a warning. My neighbor across the street, Tom Okafor, pulled me aside one evening while I was getting the mail. He looked like a man about to confess something uncomfortable. "She did this to the Hendersons on Birch Court," he said quietly. "Fined them every week for 8 months until they gave up and sold. She bought their patio furniture at the estate sale." He paused. "Linda collects trophies." I asked Tom why nobody had ever voted her out. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has just moved to a new city and still believes the train runs on time. "She controls the meeting notices," he said. "If she doesn't want you there, you don't get notified. If she doesn't want a vote counted, it gets lost in the minutes. She's been doing this for 9 years. I started paying attention differently after that conversation with Tom. I noticed that every house Linda had issues with was a house where the owners had something she wanted: a better lake view, a desirable corner lot, a fence line that gave more privacy. Her grievances weren't random. They were strategic. Linda Marsh was not a busybody. She was a chess player. The Garcias at the end of the cul-de-sac had a gorgeous magnolia tree that partially blocked Linda's sightline to the community fountain. Within 4 months of moving in, they had been fined out of that tree too. Mrs. Garcia cried when they cut it down. Linda sent a fruit basket the next day. I remember thinking that was a strange, generous thing to do. Now I understood it was a victory lap. Maya urged me to let it go. "It's just trees," she said one evening, though I could tell by the way she set down her coffee mug that she didn't quite believe that either. "We have a good life here. Sophia loves her school. Let's not make enemies." I agreed. I told myself I could live with the violations as long as they stayed on paper. I was wrong to make that deal with myself. Linda escalated to property inspections. She had somehow gotten herself appointed as the sole HOA inspector under a bylaw revision she'd passed at yet another meeting we weren't notified about. She began walking the perimeter of our property on Saturday mornings, clipboard in hand, peering over fences with a professional sort of hunger that made my skin crawl. I installed a doorbell camera. The footage from the very first weekend showed Linda not just walking the perimeter, but leaning over our side fence and photographing our backyard with her phone. Specifically, she was photographing the oak trees from multiple angles, the way someone does when they're building a case. I saved every second of that footage to 3 separate cloud drives. I sent a formal certified letter to the HOA board, all 5 members, informing them of the unauthorized photography of private property. 3 members never responded. One sent a 2-line email saying it was within Linda's inspection rights. The 5th member, a retired schoolteacher named Carolyn Duffy, called me privately and said, "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I don't know how to stop her. I've been trying for 4 years." Carolyn told me something during that phone call that I filed away carefully. She said Linda had been quietly lobbying the town planning office to have Sycamore Ridge's Lakeview designated as a protected scenic corridor, which would give her the regulatory power to demand removal of any vegetation deemed obstructive, on any property she chose. The trees weren't just an aesthetic complaint. They were a land grab dressed in a clipboard. I hired an attorney named Rebecca Cho. She specialized in property rights and HOA disputes and had the calm, precise energy of someone who had seen every version of this fight before. She reviewed everything: the violation notices, the bylaw amendments, the certified letters, the footage, and said, "The amendments that created Section 14C were passed without proper quorum notification. They may be legally invalid." She said may, but her eyes said are. Rebecca sent a formal cease and desist to the HOA board. Linda's response came not through her own attorney, but in the form of a community-wide email blast sent to every homeowner in Sycamore Ridge, describing me as a combative homeowner attempting to undermine the community standards we've all agreed to uphold. She quoted selectively from the cease and desist letter, leaving out the parts about her own violations. That email spread faster than anything Linda could have anticipated, but not in the way she intended. 3 homeowners I'd never spoken to messaged me privately that same evening. All of them had stories. The Pattersons on Elm Way, fined for the color of their porch cushions, a color that was on the HOA's own approved palette. The Nguyen's, assessed a landscaping remediation fee that disappeared into an HOA fund with no public accounting. I began quietly building a file, not just on my own situation, but on Linda's entire tenure as HOA president. Every violation notice she'd issued, every bylaw amendment passed without proper notification, every special assessment that had no paper trail. It took me about 3 weeks of evenings at the kitchen table and by the end I had a binder 2 inches thick. Maya looked at it and said, "You've become something I've never seen before." I said, "Careful." She said, "Thorough." I also started attending every HOA meeting. Every single one. I showed up early and I stayed late. I took handwritten notes and I recorded the audio on my phone, which in our state was perfectly legal without disclosure in a public meeting. Linda clocked my presence and her jaw tightened every time I walked in. She had not expected me to show up consistently. Persistence, I was learning, was its own kind of power. At the October meeting, Linda introduced a new resolution she called the Canopy Management Initiative. Under this resolution, the HOA president, meaning Linda, would have unilateral authority to order the trimming or removal of any tree deemed to obstruct shared scenic views. There was no definition of shared scenic views. There was no appeals process. There was no compensation clause. It was a blank check written to herself. I stood up and read the resolution aloud, word by word. Then I asked a single question. Which properties are adjacent to Linda's home? And what view would this resolution specifically improve for those properties? The room went quiet. Linda's smile stayed absolutely frozen in place. "That's not relevant," she said. "Please sit down, Daniel." I sat down, but 3 other homeowners exchanged glances I noticed clearly. The vote on the Canopy Management Initiative was 4-1 in favor. Carolyn voted against. The 4 who voted yes all had something in common. They were also on the HOA's social committee, a group Linda organized, catered, and effectively controlled. I walked out of that meeting knowing the board was captured. The path forward wasn't through the board. It had to be around it. Rebecca called me the morning after the October meeting. "They passed it?" she said, with a sharpness that told me she'd been half expecting this. "Okay, that resolution is almost certainly unenforceable as written. But that doesn't stop her from acting on it before we can get an injunction. If she's going to move, she'll move fast." She paused. "Daniel, how much do you love those trees?" I told Rebecca I loved the trees the way you love something that represents everything you worked for. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm going to file for a temporary restraining order based on the invalid quorum notification on the original Section 14C amendments. It's our strongest argument. But I need you to be ready. These things can take weeks, and Linda sounds like someone who won't wait weeks." She was right. Linda waited 11 days. It was a Tuesday, as I said. I was at work when it happened. Linda had hired a tree service, not the HOA's contracted landscaper, but a private crew she paid out of a discretionary fund she controlled as president. They showed up at 8 a.m. with chainsaws. My neighbor Tom saw the whole thing and called me immediately. By the time I got home at 4 p.m., 11 years of growth was gone. Linda was standing at the property line, waiting. "You're welcome," she said. "Now I can see the lake." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I took out my phone, filmed the stumps from every angle, filmed Linda standing there, filmed the sawdust across my lawn, and said, "Linda, did you authorize a private crew to perform work on my property without my consent?" She said, "The Canopy Management Initiative gave me that authority." I said, "Was my property notified in advance, as required by state law for any work on private land?" She blinked. The HOA notice was sufficient. I said, "Okay, just okay," and I went inside. Sophia was home from school when I walked in. She looked at the backyard through the sliding glass door and her face fell completely. Those trees were the backdrop of her entire childhood. She had a tire swing on one, a painted rock collection beneath another. "Dad," she said softly, "where are the trees?" I told her they were gone and that I was going to make it right. She looked at me with those careful 11-year-old eyes and said, "Promise?" I said yes. and I meant it down to my bones. Maya came home an hour later. She stood in the backyard for a long moment without speaking, and then she said something I had never heard her say in 13 years of marriage. "I want her to pay for this." I took her hand. I told her that was exactly what I was working on. And I told her about the documentation I'd been building for months. Every violation, every unauthorized meeting, every suspicious financial transaction. Maya looked at me and said, "You knew this was coming." I said, "I hoped I was wrong." I called Rebecca that evening and told her what had happened. She went very quiet in the way attorneys go quiet when they are calculating damages and restraint simultaneously. "Unauthorized entry onto your property to perform irreversible alterations," she said carefully. "Without prior written notice to you as the homeowner. Without licensed permits for the removal. Without HOA board vote. Just her unilateral decision." She paused. "Daniel, this is not a HOA dispute anymore. This is property destruction." Rebecca told me to contact the local police non-emergency line and file a report documenting the unauthorized entry and destruction. Not because the police would arrest Linda tonight, but because the report would establish an official timestamp and chain of events. I did it while we were still on the phone. The officer who took my report asked a few questions, typed quietly, and then said, "Sir, has this person done anything like this before?" I said, "That's a very good question." And then I told him about the Garcias magnolia tree. While Maya put Sophia to bed that night, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and started building something I'd been mentally designing for weeks without admitting it to myself. A detailed, time-stamped account of everything Linda Marsh had done since the day I moved in. Every notice, every meeting manipulation, every unauthorized inspection. I sourced it with documents, video stills, and statements I'd begun collecting from other neighbors. It was the most organized thing I had ever created. I called Tom Okafor at 9 p.m. He already knew. He'd texted me 3 times during the afternoon. I asked him if he would be willing to put his account of the Henderson situation in writing. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "My wife's been saying I should have done this years ago." "Yeah, Dan, I'll write it down." I asked if he knew anyone else who might do the same. He laughed a short, dark laugh. "How long do you have?" Tom called me back the next morning with 6 names. 6 Sycamore Ridge homeowners who had been on the receiving end of Linda's enforcement over the years. Fines, forced renovations, or quiet pressures that had made them consider selling. Some had sold, but the ones still here were willing to talk. I started scheduling conversations for that week, one neighbor at a time, at my kitchen table over coffee. The first person to come over was Patricia Sung, who lived 2 streets over and whose front yard had been the subject of 14 violation notices over 3 years, all related to a small koi pond she had installed with proper permits. Linda had found a way to reclassify the pond as a decorative water feature and claimed it violated a different bylaw. Patricia's HOA dues had been raised twice during that period through special assessments she later learned were never put to a full homeowner vote. Patricia sat across from me at my kitchen table, folded her hands very carefully, and said, "I want to tell you everything. I've wanted to tell someone for 2 years." She pulled out her own folder, neat, color-coded tabs, and I realized she had been waiting for this moment. She'd been building her own record, alone, hoping someone else would eventually start connecting the dots. Seeing mine on the table beside hers, she exhaled for what looked like the first time in months. By the end of the week, I had spoken with 5 of Tom's 6 names. Each conversation gave me more: receipts, emails, photos, HOA minutes with suspicious edits, assessments that didn't add up. Most powerfully, I was building a pattern, the same tactics used repeatedly on homeowners who were less likely to push back. Linda favored people who were newer to the neighborhood, people with language barriers, people who worked multiple jobs and couldn't attend daytime meetings. She targeted vulnerability the way a chess player targets isolated pieces. The sixth name Tom gave me was Marcus Webb, who had been on the HOA board itself for 2 years before resigning. Marcus was terse on the phone, clearly still carrying something heavy. He agreed to meet, but only at a coffee shop on neutral ground. He showed up in work clothes, ordered black coffee, and spent 30 seconds studying my face before he said, "You're not going to let this go, are you?" I said, "Not this time." He nodded and put his phone on the table, already recording. So did I. Marcus told me things about the HOA's finances that made my chest tighten. Linda had consolidated control over 3 separate HOA bank accounts into a single account she managed as sole signatory. She had increased her own monthly stipend as president, a stipend that wasn't in the original bylaws, by citing an administrative complexity adjustment she'd approved herself at a meeting where only 2 board members were present. Marcus had tried to raise these issues internally. That was why he'd resigned. "Why didn't you go to the county?" I asked Marcus. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Because I didn't have enough on my own. It's her word against mine, and she's been president for 9 years. She knows every official on the county HOA oversight board by first name. She's served on 3 committees with them." He looked up at me. "But you've got more than I had. You've got the trees. You've got property destruction on your hands." Literally. He tapped my folder. "And you've got me now." I told Rebecca about Marcus that same afternoon. She was already aware that unauthorized work on my property without permits could expose Linda and the HOA to significant civil liability. But Marcus's information about the finances opened a second front: potential fiduciary misconduct. Rebecca's voice took on a different quality when she heard it. Focused, fast. The way it sounds when an attorney sees multiple angles converge at once. "I'm going to need Marcus's statement in writing," she said. "And Daniel, don't talk to Linda." I hadn't intended to talk to Linda, but Linda had other intentions. She appeared at my front door 3 days after the tree removal, at 7:30 on a Saturday morning, holding what looked like a friendly coffee thermos and wearing an expression so carefully composed it must have taken practice. "Daniel," she said, "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot, and I'd love to have a conversation about moving forward constructively." Sophia was still asleep upstairs. Maya was behind me in the kitchen. I said, "Linda, my attorney has advised me not to speak with you directly. Please communicate through her office." Then I closed the door. Linda stood on my porch for 45 seconds after I closed the door. I know because I watched the doorbell camera footage. She didn't move. She just stood there, holding her thermos, recalculating. Then she walked back down my driveway with the deliberate, unhurried stride of someone who has just decided to change strategies. That footage would later become important for reasons I couldn't have predicted then. 2 days later, the HOA posted a new notice on the community bulletin board, both physical and digital, stating that recent enforcement actions had been conducted in full compliance with HOA governing documents, and that any homeowner with concerns should submit a formal grievance through the proper channels. The proper channels were a form Linda had designed, which went directly to Linda's email, which Linda was free to ignore. It was a maze she had built with herself at the center. But Linda made a mistake that week. She sent a follow-up email to the full HOA listserv congratulating herself on restoring scenic corridor access and including a photo taken from her own backyard, looking directly across what had been my tree canopy, now a clear sightline to the lake. She had taken the photo herself the day after the removal. She had captioned it, "The view we all deserve." She sent it to 114 households. She was celebrating, publicly, with evidence. I forwarded that email to Rebecca immediately. Rebecca responded in 4 minutes with a single line. She just provided her own motive on a silver platter. The email confirmed that the tree removal was not for community benefit, but for Linda's personal view from her own property. It was the kind of gift that only comes from arrogance, the absolute certainty that you will never be held accountable. I started paying more attention to Linda's property after that. Not obsessively, just with the eyes of someone who now understood the game being played. What I noticed first was that Linda's backyard fence, the one that ran along our shared property line, was set approximately 2 feet inside our actual boundary. It had always been there, so I'd assumed it was correct. I pulled the survey documents from when we bought the house. It was not correct. The survey showed that Linda's fence encroached on my property by 26 inches along a 60-foot run. That fence had been there for years, possibly predating Linda's own HOA presidency. But it was on my land. Rebecca, when I showed her the survey, did not react with the excitement I expected. Instead, she said, very calmly, "Hold on to that. Don't move on it yet. Let it ripen." She was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Meanwhile, the HOA fines kept coming. After the tree removal, Linda seemed to accelerate, as if the act had given her momentum. I received notices for my new gate latch, wrong finish, she claimed, for a section of my back fence that had weather discoloration, not up to aesthetic standards, and for a potted plant arrangement near my front step that she classified as unsanctioned landscape modification. I paid none of the fines. Rebecca advised me not to while the legal challenge to Section 14C was pending. The local newspaper, a weekly called the Sycamore Ridge Gazette, ran a small item about an ongoing property dispute in the neighborhood. It was vague, clearly sourced from the HOA's side. But the comment section online filled up fast. Several people identified themselves as Sycamore Ridge residents and described their own experiences with the HOA's enforcement. Linda posted a response under her own name calling the commenters anonymous agitators. 2 of them replied with their real names and addresses. The comments kept multiplying. Rebecca filed the motion for a temporary restraining order on a Friday. By Monday morning, a county court had issued a preliminary order requiring the HOA to cease issuing new violation notices to my property pending a hearing on the validity of the Section 14C bylaw amendments. I printed a copy of that order, framed it, and hung it inside my front door where I could see it every morning. It was the first thing that felt like solid ground in months. Linda's response to the restraining order came in a form I hadn't anticipated. She didn't fight it in court, not immediately. Instead, she convened what she called an emergency community forum in the Sycamore Ridge Clubhouse on a Wednesday evening. I received an invitation which surprised me. Rebecca said to go. "Watch what she does with an audience," Rebecca told me. "People like Linda need an audience more than they need to win." The forum was packed, about 60 homeowners, more than I'd seen at any HOA meeting before. Linda had arranged the seating theater style with herself at a podium, a projector screen behind her. She began by saying she was there to provide transparency and context about the ongoing dispute. Then she put up a slide, a photograph of my property before the tree removal. She had labeled it, "Before obstruction," and then a photo of the clear view to the lake. After community benefit. I sat in the back and said nothing. I had brought a legal pad. I took notes. So did Patricia Sung, seated 2 rows in front of me. So did Tom Okafor. So did Marcus Webb, who had come despite his own reservations. Linda noticed all of us. I could tell by the way her eyes moved around the room before settling back on the screen. She was used to performing for people who didn't have notes. Linda gave a 20-minute presentation justifying the tree removal as a legitimate exercise of the Canopy Management Initiative. She cited property values, scenic access, community character. She was polished, confident, practiced, And then she made an error that I recognized immediately as fatal. She said on record in front of 60 witnesses that she had personally authorized and overseen the removal of obstructing vegetation on my property. Personal authorization. Personally overseen. I wrote those exact words down, underlined twice. When she opened the floor for questions, I raised my hand. She paused. The room watched. She could not call on me without it being obvious. "Daniel," she said, with a smile that cost her something. I stood up. "You said you personally authorized and personally oversaw the removal. Did you obtain a permit from the county for work performed on private property that wasn't your own?" She said, "The HOA's blanket maintenance authorization covers." I said, "Can you give me the permit number?" She said, "That's not the process." I said, "So no permit," and I sat down. The room shifted. It was subtle. People didn't start booing or anything dramatic. But I felt the redistribution of attention, the way people leaned toward each other to whisper. Linda plowed forward with her prepared points, but the rhythm was broken. Tom Okafor asked the next question, about whether the full board had voted to authorize the specific removal on my property. Linda said the Canopy Management Initiative gave her unilateral authority. Tom said, very quietly, "So the other 4 board members didn't vote on this?" Linda said, "That's correct." Another whisper moved through the room. Patricia Sung raised her hand. Linda called on her with visible reluctance. Patricia stood up slowly and said, "I have a question about the special assessments in 2022 and 2023. Both were applied to my account as an individual penalty, but I was never given a board vote resolution number for either. Where can I find those vote records?" Linda said those were administrative matters and suggested Patricia contact the board secretary. Patricia said, "I did. The board secretary is you. I emailed you 4 times. Would you like to see the emails?" She held up her folder. Linda did not look at the folder. The forum ended 20 minutes ahead of schedule. Linda wrapped it up cleanly, thanked everyone for constructive community dialogue, and left through a side door before most people had gathered their belongings. But in the parking lot afterward, something remarkable happened. A dozen homeowners I had never met formed an informal cluster around Tom, Patricia, Marcus, and me. They had questions. They had their own stories. They wanted to know what we were doing and how they could be part of it. We stood in that parking lot for over an hour. I drove home that night feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not happiness exactly, but alignment. The sense that the world was starting to tilt toward the truth instead of away from it. Maya was waiting up. She'd made tea and left a mug for me on the counter. I told her about the forum, about the permit question, about Patricia with her folder, about the parking lot. Maya listened, and at the end she said, "How many people are with you now?" I counted. 14. She nodded slowly. "That's enough." The next morning I received an email from Linda, not through Rebecca's office, directly to my personal email, which she had from the HOA listserv. The email was 3 paragraphs long and very carefully written. It acknowledged that tensions had escalated and expressed a desire to find a reasonable resolution. It offered to have the HOA reimburse me for a reasonable portion of the tree's assessed value if I agreed to withdraw my legal challenge and sign a mutual release of claims. She had CC'd no one. I forwarded it to Rebecca immediately. Rebecca called me back within the hour. "She's scared," she said flatly. This is her first real move toward settlement, and she made it off the record to avoid the board seeing it. Which means she knows the board is going to have a problem with the liability exposure she's created. She paused. "Do not respond. Do not acknowledge receipt. Let her sweat. She'll send another one." I asked how long we wait. Rebecca said, Until after I depose Marcus. Marcus's written statement ran to 11 pages. He documented everything he'd witnessed as a board member. The financial irregularities, the unauthorized stipend increases, the meeting manipulations. He named dates, amounts, and specific incidents. Rebecca had it notarized and prepared it as a formal affidavit. She told me it was some of the cleanest testimony she'd ever received from a non-attorney witness. He thinks clearly under pressure, she said. Whatever Linda did to drive him off that board, it didn't shake his memory. Linda sent a second email 4 days later. Same personal address, still no CC. This time the offer was more specific. Full reimbursement for the trees based on arborist valuation, waiver of all outstanding HOA fines, and a formal written apology from the board. In exchange, she wanted me to withdraw the legal challenge, agree not to pursue further action. And this was the part that caught my attention. Agree to maintain the current sightline clearance from the now removed trees. She was trying to make the destruction permanent as part of the settlement. I showed the second email to Maya that evening. She read it twice. She wants you to agree to keep your yard cleared of anything that blocks her view. Forever. She set the paper down. She's not trying to settle. She's trying to lock in what she stole. I nodded. That was exactly what Linda was doing. The offer wasn't conciliation. It was a longer chain with a friendlier collar. Rebecca confirmed the same read when I called her. Don't respond, she said again. I'm almost ready to file the amended complaint. The amended complaint added 3 new claims to our original legal challenge. Trespass for the unauthorized entry and alteration of my property. Property destruction for the value of the 11-year-old oaks. And what Rebecca called HOA fiduciary breach, based on Marcus's affidavit and the financial documentation I'd compiled. We also formally challenged the Canopy Management Initiative as procedurally invalid. The filing was 47 pages. I read every word twice. Rebecca filed on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, the filing had been picked up by the county court's public records system. By Saturday morning, Marcus had seen it. By Saturday evening, Tom had texted it to the Sycamore Ridge neighborhood app. By Sunday morning, it had been screenshot and shared widely enough that a reporter from the regional paper, not the Gazette but the Metro section of the County Daily, reached out to Rebecca's office for comment. Rebecca gave a statement that was precise and brief. The filing speaks for itself. Her client was seeking accountability for documented property destruction and procedural violations. She was confident in the merits. She did not editorialize. She did not name-call. It was exactly right. The reporter ran a story Monday morning. It was careful, factual, and included the phrase, HOA president personally authorized unauthorized tree removal on private property without permits. I did not read the comments on that article. Maya suggested I shouldn't, and she was right. But I heard from Patricia that they ran to hundreds and were overwhelmingly in my favor. What mattered more to me was that the story identified Sycamore Ridge by name and referenced the HOA by its official designation. That meant it was searchable. That meant it was on the record permanently, regardless of what happened in court. Linda did not respond publicly to the article, but her behavior changed in observable ways that week. The HOA bulletin board, which she updated constantly, went silent. The community listserv, which she used as her personal broadcast channel, went quiet. Her Saturday morning inspection walks stopped. Tom told me he'd seen her car leaving early in the mornings and not returning until evening. Whatever she was doing it somewhere other than her usual positions of visibility. What she was doing, I would later learn, was consulting attorneys of her own. Not the HOA's general counsel, her own private attorney, retained personally. This came to me indirectly. The HOA's general counsel sent Rebecca a notice that Linda would no longer be making direct contact and that all settlement discussions should go through the HOA's official legal representation. This was significant for two reasons. First, it confirmed Linda now understood the personal liability exposure. Second, it separated Linda's interest from the HOA's, which meant there were now two defendants with potentially conflicting defenses. Rebecca explained that dynamic to me with something close to satisfaction. When a board president acts unilaterally, without board vote, without permits on private property, and then gets sued, the HOA's insurer may argue that the act was outside the scope of her authority, which means they don't cover it. That puts the personal liability on Linda alone. She let that sit. Her personal attorney's job right now is to get the HOA's counsel to absorb as much of the blame as possible. The HOA's counsel's job is the opposite. I said, "So they're fighting each other." She said, "Welcome to where we want to be." The community hearing on the preliminary restraining order was set for 6 weeks out. But the week before the hearing, something unexpected happened. The county's Code Enforcement Division contacted Rebecca's office. Apparently, the news article had been seen by someone in that office who recognized the address. They had looked up the permit history for my property. There were no permits on file for the tree removal. Code enforcement had opened an independent investigation. I had not initiated that contact. Tom hadn't. Patricia hadn't. The article had done it on its own. This is what Linda had not calculated. That once a story is public, it attracts actors she couldn't control. Code enforcement was not a party to our civil case. They operated on their own authority, their own timeline, their own standards. And they had found something. Not just the missing removal permit, but a second issue. The tree removal had disturbed a protected root zone boundary that was noted on my property's original environmental assessment from 2003. The environmental angle was one I genuinely hadn't seen coming. Sycamore Ridge had been developed in the early 2000s on land that included a portion of protected watershed territory. The oaks I had planted were within that zone. Disturbing the root systems in that zone without environmental clearance was a separate violation, not of HOA rules or property law, but of the county's Environmental Protection Ordinance. Code enforcement scope had just expanded significantly. So had Linda's problem. Rebecca called me the day she learned about the environmental angle. "Daniel," she said, "I need you to understand that this has moved beyond what either of us started with. This is now a multi-agency situation with civil and potentially regulatory dimensions." I asked if that was good or bad. She said, "For you? Almost certainly good. For Linda," she paused. "She authorized the cutting of trees in a protected watershed zone without permits. That carries personal fines of up to $50,000 per violation under the county environmental ordinance." I sat down when she said that. I didn't gloat. I want to be clear about that. I was sitting in my backyard, looking at 11 stumps arranged where living trees used to be, and I felt not triumph but something closer to grief mixed with resolve. Sophia came out and sat next to me. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Dad, will we plant new ones?" I said yes. I said we would plant new ones and that we would plant them so that in 11 years, when she came back to visit, they would be exactly as tall as the ones that were gone. She leaned her head against my arm. "Good," she said. The HOA board held an emergency closed session. I know because Tom attended and gave me the sanitized version he'd managed to pick up from a board member who was already quietly panicking. The session reportedly focused on the HOA's insurance carrier, who had sent a preliminary letter suggesting that Linda's unilateral action might constitute a willful act excluded from the policy's coverage. If that exclusion held, the HOA, not just Linda personally, was exposed. The board was beginning to understand that they had been used as cover and that the cover wasn't going to hold. Carolyn Duffy called me directly for the second time. Her voice was different than it had been before. Tighter, more urgent. "Daniel, there are 3 board members who would vote to censure Linda right now if they thought it would help them," she said. "They're scared. The insurance letter scared them. The code enforcement investigation scared them. The article scared them." She paused. "What do you need from me?" I told her what I needed. I told her to call Rebecca. Carolyn met with Rebecca the following week. What came out of that meeting was significant. Carolyn was willing to provide a sworn statement confirming that she had repeatedly raised procedural concerns about Linda's methods, meeting notifications, bylaw amendments, financial decisions, and had been consistently overruled or dismissed. She also confirmed that she had never been properly notified of the meeting at which the Canopy Management Initiative was passed. Her statement independently corroborated everything we had built from the outside. With Carolyn's statement, we now had testimony from an active board member contradicting the HOA's official position. Rebecca said it was the kind of inside corroboration that changes settlement calculations entirely. She reached out to the HOA's counsel to schedule a mediation session. The HOA's counsel agreed within 48 hours, a speed that told Rebecca they were desperate to get this into a room before it went any further in court or in the press. I told Maya about the mediation being scheduled. She set down her paintbrush. She'd been working on a canvas in the kitchen that afternoon and looked at me steadily. "What do you want out of this?" she asked. "Not what do you think you'll get. What do you want?" I sat down at the table and thought about it honestly. I want the trees replaced. I want the illegal fines removed. I want Linda removed from the board. And I want the record to be clean. Every family she did this to. Maya nodded. "Then say that in the room." The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at a neutral office downtown. Rebecca and I sat on one side of a long conference table. Across from us, the HOA's general counsel, 2 board members, not Linda and not Carolyn, 2 of the silent middle ones, and the HOA's insurance representative. Linda was not present. Her personal attorney had sent a letter indicating she would participate separately in any negotiations relevant to personal claims against her. She was already trying to separate her fate from the HOA's. Rebecca opened by laying out our claims calmly and with complete documentation. She presented the survey showing fence encroachment. She presented the arborist's valuation of the trees. She presented the code enforcement investigation status. She presented Marcus's affidavit. She presented Carolyn's statement. She presented the email Linda had sent celebrating the view, the one she'd broadcast to 114 households. The insurance representative's expression changed 3 times in the first 15 minutes. The HOA's counsel barely spoke. By noon, the HOA's counsel had made an initial offer. It was low, a fraction of the arborist's valuation, no admission of wrongdoing, and a confidentiality clause that would have prevented me from discussing the case. Rebecca declined it without consulting me, which she was authorized to do. "We're not here for partial credit," she said, "and there will be no confidentiality clause." The insurance rep asked for a recess. We stepped into the hallway. Rebecca said, "They'll come back with something real." She was right. The second offer came after a 90-minute recess. It included full arborist-valued compensation for the trees, waiver of all HOA fines against my property dating back 3 years, a formal board resolution acknowledging the procedural violations, and a commitment to an independent financial audit of the HOA accounts. It did not include removal of Linda from the board. It did not include any resolution about other homeowners she had harmed. Rebecca asked for another recess to consult me. I sat with Rebecca in a small side room and thought about the offer. It was substantial. It addressed my direct damages. But it left Linda in place and it left everyone else. The Pattersons, the Garcias, Patricia, Tom's 6 names without any remedy. Rebecca watched me think. "It's a fair resolution for your case," she said carefully. "But it's not complete justice." I asked what complete justice would require. She said, "Pushing further, which means more time, more exposure, more risk, but also more possibility." I thought about Sophia asking me to promise. I said, "We push further." The mediator told both parties that we were not reaching agreement that day and scheduled a follow-up session. The HOA's counsel looked relieved. They had clearly expected this. The insurance rep looked like someone doing math in their head that was coming out in ways they didn't like. We packed up and walked out into a gray November afternoon. Rebecca and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. "Now we wait," she said, "and we let code enforcement do some of the work for us." The wait was 14 days, and they were strange, quiet days in Sycamore Ridge. The community listserv, which Linda had dominated for years, was now a different space. Homeowners were posting things Linda would never have permitted: questions about the HOA budget, requests for meeting minutes, discussion threads about the environmental investigation. It was as if her silence had created a vacuum and people were moving into it. Tom started a separate neighborhood chat group outside the official HOA channels. Within a week, it had 67 members, more than half the neighborhood. People shared information freely there, the kind of information Linda had always managed to suppress through her control of official communications. Someone shared a copy of the original HOA bylaws from 2001. Several people pointed out amendments that had appeared without proper documentation. The conversation was civil, detailed, and relentless. Sophia had a science project due on watershed ecosystems that month. The irony was not lost on me or on her. She interviewed me for one section and asked about the environmental impact of removing mature trees near watershed zones. I answered carefully, factually. She transcribed my words in her neat block handwriting. Her teacher gave her an A and wrote in the margin, "Clearly researched from primary sources. Well done." Sophia showed me the paper with a quiet pride that felt like it was about more than the grade. I hadn't spoken to Linda since I'd closed the door in her face, but I saw her across the distance of the neighborhood occasionally, getting her mail, backing out of her driveway. She had a way of carrying herself that hadn't changed even now, with the investigation open and the mediation unresolved. She walked with the posture of someone who expects the world to accommodate them. I had thought that might waver. It hadn't. That told me something important about who I was dealing with. Patricia Sung called me one evening to tell me she'd been approached by a woman named Deborah who had moved out of Sycamore Ridge 18 months ago after what she described as an unbearable 2-year enforcement campaign. Deborah now lived in a different suburb, but had seen the newspaper article and reached out. She had records, fines, notices, emails from her time in the neighborhood. She also had something none of us had: a voicemail from Linda, left during the campaign, that had been saved and backed up. Patricia said it was something you need to hear. I met Deborah at Patricia's house the following Saturday. She was quiet, precise, and clearly had been waiting for the moment to share what she carried. She played the voicemail. It was Linda's voice, unmistakably calm, measured, and saying something that in any other context would have seemed innocuous, but in the context of what had happened to Deborah's property, was anything but. Linda said, "I think you'll find that the process has ways of moving things along when cooperation isn't forthcoming. It's just how communities maintain their standards." She said it the way a person says something they believe will never be repeated to anyone who matters. Rebecca listened to the voicemail twice. Then she said, "This establishes a pattern of deliberate, targeted enforcement used as a coercive tool. Combined with everything else, this is not just negligence or overreach. This is a documented pattern of conduct." She was already typing. I'm adding Deborah's account and the voicemail transcript to our amended filing, and I'm going to reach out to the County HOA Oversight Board. They have administrative enforcement authority Linda cannot control through meeting notices. The County HOA Oversight Board was a body I hadn't known existed until Rebecca mentioned it. They operated under the state's Common Interest Development Act and had authority to investigate HOA governance violations, compel financial audits, remove officers for fiduciary misconduct, and refer cases for criminal prosecution where fraud was present. Linda had served on advisory committees with members of this board. She knew them by name, but she had apparently never believed she would be the subject of their attention. That was about to change. Rebecca submitted a formal complaint to the County HOA Oversight Board on a Monday. By Wednesday, the board had acknowledged receipt. By Friday, they had sent Linda, in her capacity as HOA president, a formal notice of inquiry requiring her to produce all HOA financial records, meeting minutes and correspondence related to enforcement actions over the past 5 years. The letter cited 3 specific statutory provisions. Linda signed for it personally. I know because the tracking number confirmed delivery. The Oversight Board notice was the first moment I felt the weight of the situation tip irreversibly. Everything before had been a contest, Linda against me, documentation against denial, attorney against attorney. But a state regulatory body issuing a formal notice of inquiry is not a contest. It is a mechanism, and mechanisms don't care about 9 years of accumulated neighborhood authority. They care about records and compliance. Linda's response to the Oversight Board notice arrived in our neighborhood chat, not the official listserv, Tom's group, through an unexpected channel. One of the HOA board members, the youngest one, a man named Derek who had always seemed more compliant than committed, sent Tom a private message. He was rattled. He said Linda had convened an emergency board meeting without proper notice, again, and had instructed all board members to refer all inquiries from any regulatory body directly to her. She was trying to centralize the response through herself. Derek was asking if that was legal. Tom called me. I called Rebecca. Rebecca said it might constitute obstruction if she was directing board members to suppress records. The financial audit that the HOA's own counsel had agreed to in mediation had stalled. The HOA's insurer had apparently decided they wanted to control the scope of the audit, which meant keeping it narrow. Rebecca had anticipated this and had separately requested that the County Oversight Board's inquiry include an independent financial review. Now those 2 tracks were converging in a way that made the insurer's attempt to limit the audit irrelevant. The Oversight Board wasn't asking for permission. They were issuing subpoenas. Subpoenas. I had never expected that word to appear in a dispute that started with my trees. But here we were. The Oversight Board subpoenaed the HOA's bank records going back 7 years. They subpoenaed the meeting minutes archive. They subpoenaed the HOA's email server, a server that Linda managed personally through a private domain she controlled. Rebecca told me that was the key detail. Linda's control of the HOA's communications infrastructure meant there was a question of whether she had selectively deleted or modified records. The Oversight Board had retained a forensic IT firm. I went for a run that Saturday morning for the first time in weeks. I ran the loop around Sycamore Ridge that I used to run when we first moved in before all of this. I ran past the stumps in my yard. I ran past Linda's house, which was quiet, curtains drawn, car in the driveway. I ran past Tom's house and he waved from the driveway where he was washing his car. I ran past Patricia's house and she looked up from her garden and gave me a small nod. I was still angry, but the anger had become something functional, something I could carry without dropping. 3 days after the subpoenas were issued, Linda's personal attorney filed a motion to quash, arguing that the Oversight Board's inquiry exceeded its statutory authority and violated Linda's personal privacy rights. The motion was 31 pages long, which meant it had been in preparation for some time. She had known the subpoenas were coming. She had been building her legal defense quietly while pretending to negotiate in good faith. Rebecca called it a classic delay tactic by someone who knows the documents are damaging. The motion to quash failed. The hearing took one afternoon. The Oversight Board's counsel presented the statutory authority cleanly and clearly, and the judge denied the motion from the bench. Linda's attorney asked for a stay pending appeal. Denied. The subpoenas stood. Bank records, meeting minutes, email server, all to be produced within 21 days. I sat in the back of that courtroom gallery, public proceeding, my right to attend, and watched Linda's attorney write a note on his legal pad that he immediately flipped face down. During those 21 days, something remarkable happened in Sycamore Ridge that I had not orchestrated and did not expect. The homeowners in Tom's chat group began organizing independently. They were not coordinating with me or with Rebecca. They were doing something separate, something grassroots. They drafted a petition calling for a special election to replace the HOA board, citing loss of confidence in the current leadership. Within 5 days, the petition had 71 signatures. There were 114 households in Sycamore Ridge. 71 signatures was a majority. The petition was submitted to the HOA's governing documents process, which, according to the original bylaws, not Linda's amendments, required a special election if a majority of homeowners requested one. Linda's amendments to the bylaws had attempted to remove that provision, but the amendment had been passed at one of the improperly noticed meetings, which meant, under the challenge we'd already filed, it was procedurally invalid. The original provision stood. The special election had to be held. Linda announced the special election date via the official HOA listserv. It was set 6 weeks out, the maximum time the bylaws permitted. She was buying every day she could. But she also sent a second message, carefully written, to the listserv. It was the most personal communication she had ever sent to the community. She described her 9 years of dedicated service, her deep commitment to maintaining property values, and her pain at being the subject of politically motivated attacks. She asked for trust. She asked for patience. She did not mention the subpoenas. Patricia responded to Linda's listserv message, publicly, in the thread, her name attached. She wrote 3 paragraphs. She described her koi pond situation in detail, the permits she'd obtained, the 14 violation notices she'd received, the special assessments she'd paid. She attached PDFs of the permits and notices. She did not call Linda names. She presented only facts. By the end of that day, other homeowners had posted similar accounts in the thread. The thread had 89 replies by midnight. Linda's next move surprised me. It was smart, which I had to respect even as I opposed it. She began reaching out privately to the homeowners she had the best relationships with, particularly those on the social committee who had always supported her votes. She was building a counter-coalition, trying to shore up enough votes to survive the special election or at least maintain some influence over whoever replaced her. She was doing what she'd always done, working the relationships, managing the information, staying ahead by one move. But she had miscalculated something fundamental this time. In the past, the people she targeted with her private outreach had no way of knowing she was doing the same with everyone else. This time, they were all in Tom's chat group. Within 48 hours of her campaign beginning, 4 different people had shared screenshots of her private messages in the group. Her overtures were visible to everyone simultaneously. The private coalition she was trying to build collapsed before it could form. People who might have stayed quiet now felt manipulated. That cost her. I got a call from a number I didn't recognize on a Thursday evening. The woman on the other end said her name was Janet, that she'd lived in Sycamore Ridge for 2 years, and that she had something she needed to tell me that she hadn't told anyone. I said I was listening. She said that 8 months ago, Linda had come to her house privately and told her that I, Daniel Reyes, was the kind of person who files nuisance lawsuits to extort HOAs, and that I had a history of this behavior in other neighborhoods. None of that was true. Linda had fabricated it. Janet said she hadn't believed it entirely at the time, but it had made her cautious about me. Then she'd seen the article, seen the petition, seen Patricia's post. And she'd realized that Linda had been running a separate information campaign against me, feeding false narratives to neighbors to preemptively isolate me. I think she did it to a lot of people, Janet said. I think she told different people different things about you. I thanked her. After I hung up, I sat for a long time thinking about the scale of what Linda had built. This wasn't just a property dispute. This was an information ecosystem she had constructed over 9 years to control an entire neighborhood. I called Rebecca and told her about Janet. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's defamation. If she knowingly made false statements about your character to third parties in ways that damaged your reputation, that's a separate tort." She paused. "Would Janet put that in writing?" I said I thought she would. Rebecca said, "Ask her. And ask her if there are others Linda said similar things to. Because if this is a pattern, and it sounds like it is, we're looking at a much broader picture of conduct than we've been litigating." Janet was willing to put it in writing. She also gave me 2 other names, neighbors Linda had spoken to about me privately. I reached out to both. One didn't respond. The other, a man named George who lived on Birch Court, not only confirmed what Linda had said but added that she'd told him specifically that I had lost a lawsuit against an HOA in Arizona 3 years ago. I had never lived in Arizona. I had never been in a lawsuit before this one. Linda had invented a fictional legal history for me and shared it as fact. George's confirmation gave me 4 documented instances of Linda making false, material statements about me to neighbors. Janet, George, and 2 others we pieced together through follow-up conversations. Rebecca prepared a defamation claim addendum to our existing filing. When she described the claim to me, she used the phrase actual malice, which has a specific legal meaning involving knowingly false statements, and said the fabricated Arizona lawsuit story was a particularly clear example. Linda had not just stretched the truth. She had invented it wholesale. The 21-day deadline for producing the subpoena documents passed. Linda produced some records, selectively. The HOA's general counsel submitted a partial document production that included meeting minutes for 4 of the 7 years requested, bank statements with certain line items redacted, and no emails from the HOA's server, citing an ongoing technical migration that Linda claimed had resulted in data loss. The Oversight Board's forensic IT firm was already engaged. They were not going to accept technical migration as an explanation. The forensic IT firm's preliminary report came back in less than 2 weeks. They had accessed the email server's backup logs, backups that Linda apparently had not known existed or had not been able to delete. The logs showed a significant pattern of email deletion from Linda's account over a 10-day period that precisely corresponded to the days between when she received the Oversight Board notice and when she signed for the subpoenas. She had been deleting emails after receiving notice of the investigation. That is called spoliation of evidence. It is very serious. When Rebecca told me about the spoliation finding, she used a tone I hadn't heard from her before, something between clinical precision and suppressed satisfaction. Destruction of evidence after receiving legal notice is not a procedural misstep, she said. It is an independent legal violation that can result in sanctions, adverse inference instructions, and in cases of intentional destruction, criminal referral. She paused. She panicked. And when she panicked, she made the single worst decision she could have made. The Oversight Board's investigators returned to the HOA's records with expanded authority following the spoliation finding. What the surviving emails revealed, and what the backup logs reconstructed, was more than any of us had fully anticipated. There were communications between Linda and a county planning commissioner named Robert Fielding that went back 4 years. They discussed the scenic corridor designation Linda had been pursuing. They discussed properties that needed vegetation management to improve corridor access. Several of those properties belonged to homeowners who had subsequently received enforcement campaigns, including mine. Robert Fielding was not a name I knew, but Rebecca recognized the position immediately. Planning commissioner, she said. If she was coordinating with a county official to target private properties for vegetation removal in exchange for advancing the scenic corridor designation, that's not a HOA dispute anymore. That's potentially government corruption. She said it evenly, the way someone says a thing they've been suspecting for some time. I'm referring this to the County Inspector General's office. Today, I told Maya about Robert Fielding that evening. She set down her fork at dinner very deliberately. Sophia was doing homework in the other room. Maya leaned forward and said quietly, "This is bigger than us." I said yes. She said, "Are you okay?" I thought about it. I said yes again, but with more uncertainty. The thing I had started as a fight for my yard had grown into something I could no longer contain in a single frame. I was glad it had, but I was also a little stunned by where we were. Sophia came into the kitchen during dinner to show us a photo she'd taken in the backyard. She had placed a small painted stone at the base of each stump, 11 stones, each one a different color. On each stone she had written one word in paint marker. Together they spelled out a sentence. Trees remember even when they're gone. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Maya had it printed and hung it in the kitchen. It became the first thing I saw every morning when I made coffee. The Inspector General's office moved faster than I expected. Within 10 days of Rebecca's referral, they had opened a preliminary inquiry into Robert Fielding's communications with Linda Marsh. This was not public information. It came to me through a source I won't name, someone inside county government who had been watching this unfold and who believed in what we were doing. The inquiry was real and it was active. Fielding had been quietly placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. He would later resign. Linda's world was contracting, but she hadn't stopped fighting. At the HOA special election, now 4 weeks out, she announced she would be running for re-election to her own seat. This was her right under the bylaws. She also announced the formation of what she called the Sycamore Ridge Values Committee, a slate of candidates she was backing for the other board seats. She put up signs. She held a coffee morning at her house. She was running a campaign as if the investigation didn't exist. Tom's chat group mobilized in response. 14 homeowners agreed to run for the 5 board seats. Tom himself agreed to run for president. Patricia Sung agreed to run for treasurer. She had a background in nonprofit accounting. Marcus Webb, despite everything Linda had put him through, agreed to run for secretary. He wanted to see the financial audit through from the inside. Carolyn Duffy agreed to keep her seat if re-elected. It was the most organized civic action Sycamore Ridge had ever seen. I was asked to run for a board seat myself. I declined. Rebecca had advised against it. The appearance of using the lawsuit as a political springboard would give Linda ammunition. But more than that, I didn't want the board seat. I wanted accountability, and I wanted to be able to stay in this neighborhood with my family without the weight of governing it. What I wanted was a neighborhood that governed itself fairly, without anyone at the center who treated it as a personal kingdom. That was what Tom and Patricia and Marcus were for. Linda escalated her public campaign in ways that became increasingly transparent in their desperation. She sent a mailer, physical mail, printed and delivered, to every household in Sycamore Ridge. The mailer was 4 pages long and was titled, "The Truth About the Lawsuit." It described me as a litigious agitator, whose lawsuit was designed to destabilize the community for personal financial gain. It included what appeared to be a legal document, but which Rebecca identified on first reading as a fabricated summary of a fictional prior case. Linda had created a fake legal document and mailed it to 114 houses. Rebecca's response to the mailer was instantaneous. She filed for a court order requiring Linda to send a retraction and correction to the same 114 households. The filing included the defamation evidence we'd already gathered and cited the mailer as the most recent and most public instance of the pattern. The judge granted the order within 72 hours, a speed that told me the judge had read the filing and had formed a view. Linda's attorney requested a meeting with Rebecca to discuss settlement on the defamation claim specifically. Rebecca agreed to the meeting. The defamation settlement meeting happened on a Friday afternoon, without me present, just Rebecca and Linda's personal attorney. I waited at home, working in the garden with Maya, trying not to check my phone every 5 minutes. Rebecca called at 6 p.m. Linda's attorney is authorized to settle the defamation claims, she said. He's offering a monetary amount, a public retraction, and Linda's personal agreement not to make further statements about you to third parties. I asked about the rest, the trees, the financial misconduct, the oversight board. Rebecca said, "That's separate. We're not settling that today." I said, "Good." The retraction letter went out the following Tuesday, mailed by Linda's attorney's office to all 114 households. It was brief, carefully worded to avoid admitting more than the settlement required, but it was unambiguous. The statements in the prior mailer regarding Daniel Reyes's legal history were factually inaccurate and are retracted. Several neighbors texted me after receiving it. The most memorable message came from a woman I'd never met who wrote simply, "We always knew she was lying. It's nice to see it in writing." The HOA special election was now 2 weeks away. Linda's Values Committee slate had quieted significantly after the retraction letter. 2 of the 3 candidates she'd recruited withdrew from the race without public explanation. Linda herself remained on the ballot. She put up more signs. She knocked on doors. She was running on 9 years of established relationships, and some of those relationships held not many but some. I respected the stubbornness of it, in the way you respect a wall that keeps standing even after the foundation has cracked. For days before the election, the County Oversight Board released a preliminary findings report. It was a public document, legally required to be posted publicly. The findings were stark. The HOA had conducted at least 11 improperly noticed meetings over 5 years. At least 6 bylaw amendments, including Section 14C and the Canopy Management Initiative, were procedurally invalid. The HOA's financial records showed a pattern of special assessments without proper board authorization, and the president's conduct showed substantial evidence of intentional misrepresentation to homeowners. The word intentional was in the findings, in boldface. The Oversight Board's preliminary findings were shared in Tom's chat group within an hour of public posting. By evening, they had been posted on the neighborhood app, the local Nextdoor page, and the comments section of the original newspaper article. By the next morning, the County Daily had run a follow-up story. The headline used the Oversight Board's own language. HOA President's conduct shows substantial evidence of intentional misrepresentation. Linda had not anticipated the report landing 4 days before the election. The timing was not something I had arranged. It was simply the pace of institutional process. Linda did not campaign the final 4 days before the election. Her signs stayed up, but her door-knocking stopped. Her car was in the driveway most of each day. One of her closest allies on the old social committee, a woman named Beverly who had attended every one of Linda's events and voted with her on everything, publicly endorsed Tom Okafor 2 days before the election. She posted in Tom's chat group and said, "I've been wrong about some things. It's not too late to be right." Beverly's endorsement broke something open in the neighborhood. Election day was a Saturday. Sycamore Ridge held its vote in the community clubhouse, the same room where Linda had once run her meetings like a private court. Turnout was the highest the HOA had ever recorded. 94 of 114 households participated. I voted early and then took Sophia to the farmer's market while Maya stayed home. When we came back with fresh produce and a jar of local honey, the counting was almost done. Tom texted me at 2:17 p.m. A single line, "We won all 5 seats." Linda lost her seat by 61 votes to 33. Tom Okafor became HOA president by 72 votes. Patricia Sung became treasurer. Marcus Webb became secretary. Carolyn Duffy kept her seat. The 5th new member was a young woman named Anika Patel who had moved into the neighborhood 8 months ago and had been one of the first to sign the petition. The new board held its first meeting that same evening, in the same clubhouse, with the chairs rearranged so there was no podium. Everyone sat at the same table. I attended the first meeting of the new board. So did about 40 homeowners. Tom ran the meeting the way I imagine meetings are supposed to run, with an agenda circulated in advance, speaking time distributed fairly, and decisions made by recorded vote. The first resolution passed by the new board was the rescission of all procedurally invalid bylaw amendments from the past 5 years, including Section 14C and the Canopy Management Initiative. The vote was unanimous. The room applauded. It was a small sound, but it meant something enormous. The second resolution was the commissioning of a full independent financial audit of the HOA accounts going back 7 years. The third resolution was the establishment of a homeowner grievance review committee to examine past enforcement actions and determine remediation for homeowners who had been improperly fined. Patricia chaired that committee. The first name on her list was not mine. It was the Garcias, whose magnolia tree had been forced out years before I'd ever arrived. Linda attended the first new board meeting. She sat in the back, near the door, in the same chair where I had once sat taking notes with a legal pad. She said nothing. She did not raise her hand. When the meeting ended and people filed out, she was one of the last to leave. Tom told me later that as she walked past him, she paused for a moment, as if about to say something, and then didn't. She walked out into the evening and got into her car and drove away. He didn't know what to make of that pause. I thought I did. The Inspector General's investigation into Robert Fielding continued through the winter. It was not connected to our civil case, but the findings eventually made it into the public record. Fielding had exchanged approximately 200 emails with Linda over 4 years. In those emails, he had provided her with advance notice of pending county land use decisions that affected Sycamore Ridge, information he was not authorized to share. In exchange, Linda had provided him with a standing invitation to use the Sycamore Ridge Community Clubhouse, which she controlled, for private events. The investigation found this arrangement inconsistent with public duties. Fielding resigned before any formal charges were filed. Linda's behavior in the weeks after the election had a quality I hadn't expected: normalcy. She continued living in her house. She walked her dog in the morning. She waved, a short, tight wave, to neighbors she passed. She stopped attending HOA meetings, but she didn't leave the neighborhood. I had half expected her to put her house on the market. She didn't. This told me something. She wasn't finished. She was just regrouping. I kept my documentation organized and my camera rolling. The civil case went into discovery during those months. Linda's attorney produced documents in response to our requests, most of them under court order, the ones she had not managed to delete. What the discovery materials confirmed, among other things, was that Linda had been in contact with the tree service she'd hired before the Canopy Management Initiative had even been passed. She had made preliminary arrangements for the removal 2 weeks before the vote. The initiative had been written specifically to authorize something she had already decided to do. The discovery materials also contained something else. An email from Linda to herself. She had a habit of emailing herself notes, in which she wrote out a summary of her plan for my property. She referred to my trees as the Reyes obstruction. She laid out a sequence of actions. Pass the initiative, wait 1 month, hire the private crew, document the result, respond to any legal pushback with the community benefit argument. She had a plan. She had always had a plan. She had just been certain she could execute it without consequence. Rebecca showed me that email in her office. She had printed it on a single sheet and slid it across the desk to me. I read it twice. Linda had written, in her own words, to herself, that the removal of my trees was a premeditated decision made before the authority to do so had been established. It was almost a confession. It was certainly evidence of premeditation. Rebecca said, "This is what moves the needle from negligence to intentional misconduct." She said it quietly, the way you say something important that doesn't need emphasis. Our mediation resumed. This time Linda was present, physically in the room, required to attend after her personal attorney had entered the settlement process. I had not been in the same room as Linda since the community forum months before. She looked the same, composed, well-dressed, prepared. She met my eyes briefly when we came in and then looked away. I noticed she had arranged to sit at the far end of the table from me. I sat where Rebecca put me and I watched the room. The mediation lasted 6 hours. Rebecca laid out the complete picture. The premeditated email, the deleted evidence, the defamation campaign, the regulatory findings, the financial irregularities. Linda's personal attorney argued that his client had acted in good faith within her reasonable understanding of her authority. Rebecca put the self-addressed email on the table and said, "This document describes a plan formulated before the authority to execute it existed. That is not a good faith misunderstanding." Linda looked at the email and then looked away. She did not dispute it. By the end of the mediation, we had the framework of a comprehensive settlement. Not a signed agreement that would take weeks of back and forth, but a framework both sides acknowledged. Linda personally would pay the full arborist assessed value of the trees, which the arborist had calculated based on the tree's age, species, and ecological contribution, $47,000. She would also pay for replanting a landscaping plan of my choosing, with new oaks and a 5-year growth guarantee from a licensed nursery. Her homeowner's insurance was covering a portion, but a significant personal contribution remained. The HOA separately agreed to the financial audit, the grievance review process, and a formal acknowledgement of the invalid bylaw amendments. The HOA's insurer contributed to a fund administered by the new board to compensate other homeowners who had been improperly fined. The total remediation for the neighborhood, beyond my own damages, came to just over $80,000. Patricia, as the new treasurer, would oversee its distribution through the grievance committee. Linda's personal settlement terms included one provision I had insisted on and Rebecca had fought for through 3 separate draft versions. Linda was required to sign a sworn statement acknowledging that she had personally authorized the removal of trees on my property without proper permits, without board vote, and in furtherance of a personal scenic benefit rather than a community benefit. This acknowledgement would become part of the public court record. Not sealed. Public. Linda signed the settlement agreement on a Wednesday afternoon. Her attorney had told her the alternative was trial, a trial at which the premeditated email, the spoliated evidence, the deleted communications with Fielding, and the oversight board findings would all be presented to a jury. She signed. Rebecca sent me a message from the signing. Done. 1 word. I read it at my kitchen table, looked out the window at the 11 stumps in my yard, and exhaled for what felt like the first time in a year. The settlement was filed in the public court record 3 days later. It became searchable. It included the sworn acknowledgement. The county daily ran one more story, brief, factual, noting that the HOA dispute had been resolved with a significant financial settlement and that the former HOA president had signed a public acknowledgement of unauthorized property alterations. The story did not need editorializing. The facts editorialized themselves. The landscaping company I chose was a woman-owned business called Groundwork and Grow. Their project manager, a woman named Irene, came out to survey the stumps and the soil and the light conditions of my backyard. She crouched next to each stump, felt the soil, looked up at the sky through the space where the canopy used to be, and said, "We can do this. It'll take time, but we can do this." I appreciated that she said both parts. It would take time, but it could be done. Groundwork and Grow scheduled the planting for early spring. 11 new oaks, same species, Quercus alba, white oak, selected from the same nursery supplier that the landscape architects at Sycamore Ridge had used in the original development. Irene had researched this specifically. She wanted continuity of species, continuity of root character. She said, "In 20 years, someone standing where you're standing won't be able to tell these aren't original." I thought about Sophia standing there in 20 years. I thought that was exactly right. The final piece of the settlement I hadn't told anyone about. Not Tom, not Patricia, not even Maya until the day it was confirmed, was the fence. Rebecca had held it in reserve throughout the entire process, the way a careful card player holds one card face down until the moment it matters. In the final settlement terms, Linda was required to remove the encroaching fence and have it rebuilt at the correct boundary line, with all costs covered by her. She was also required to sign a corrected survey acknowledgement with the county. 26 inches of my land, returned. Maya cried when I told her about the fence. Not because of the 26 inches, we had barely noticed the encroachment before I'd found it. She cried because of what it represented, the totality of the correction. Every inch of what had been taken was being restored. The trees, the land, the truth, the record. It wasn't perfect. 11 years of grown oak is not replaceable in a legal document. But it was the fullest remedy the system could provide, and we had obtained every part of it. Maya held my face in her hands and said, "You kept the promise." I want to be careful about how I describe what happened to Linda after the settlement. She was not destroyed. She still lived in her house. She still walked her dog. She was no longer president of the HOA, no longer had authority over anyone's property or fines or meeting agendas. The County Oversight Board had issued a formal finding that was attached to the HOA's public record for 5 years. The public court acknowledgement was searchable forever. She had been accountable, not vindicated, not forgiven, not erased, but accountable. In a neighborhood dispute, that is sometimes the most honest ending there is. What happened next I had not planned. It arrived from the outside, the way the most significant things usually do. A woman named Sarah Merritt contacted Rebecca's office 6 weeks after the settlement. She lived in a different HOA community 3 towns over and had read the newspaper article. Her HOA had a president named Gerald who had been operating in ways that felt familiar. Unauthorized meeting controls, targeted enforcement, suspicious finances. She was asking whether our documentation strategy could be replicated. Rebecca gave her my number with my permission. I talked to Sarah for 2 hours. Then came Frank and Joan Delaney from a senior living HOA community in the next county, where the president had used the enforcement apparatus to push out residents who complained about maintenance issues. Then a woman named Priya who ran a renters advocacy group and wanted to understand how HOA oversight mechanisms worked at the county level. Then a property rights attorney in a neighboring state who had read the oversight board findings and wanted to cite them in his own case. What I had built as a defense had become something else. A model, a reference, a record that others could use. I hadn't set out to become any kind of public figure or resource. I still haven't. I answered the calls that came, and I shared the documentation strategy openly because secrecy had always been Linda's tool, and openness was the opposite of that. I gave people the binder framework, the communication templates, the chronology methodology. I told them to find their Carolyn Duffy on the board, their Marcus Webb on the inside, their Patricia Sung with a folder of receipts. The ingredients are almost always there. What's needed is someone willing to connect them. Sophia asked me one evening, while we were watching a nature documentary about old-growth forests, whether I thought the new trees would be as good as the old ones. I said they would be different, younger, thinner, not yet the full presence the old ones had been. But that in 20 years they would be enormous, and in 50 years they would be the old ones. She said, "So we're just planting them for the future?" I said that's mostly what tree planting is. She thought about this and said, "That seems right." Then she went back to the documentary. The new board, Tom, Patricia, Marcus, Carolyn, and Anika, had been in place for 4 months when I noticed something that made me smile for the first time in a long while without having to think about it. The HOA bulletin board, which Linda had always used as a one-way broadcast from president to community, had been restructured. It was now a community board anyone could post with a simple content guideline Tom had drafted. The first thing posted by a homeowner was a photo of a neighborhood kid's lost cat. The second was a recommendation for a good plumber. The third was an announcement for a block party. Small, ordinary things. The right things. The financial audit was completed in the spring. It found what Marcus had suspected. Approximately $23,000 in special assessment funds that could not be accounted for through proper board authorization. The audit report was shared with all homeowners and with the county oversight board. It was referred to the county attorney's office for review of whether any criminal charges were appropriate. I was not involved in that referral. That was the oversight board's decision to make, based on their own mandate. The system, imperfect as it is, was doing what systems are supposed to do when someone fights to activate them. Linda received a letter from the county attorney's office in the spring. I know this because Carolyn told me. She had remained on the board and had been copied on HOA correspondence related to the financial findings, some of which implicated the HOA itself. The letter requested Linda's voluntary cooperation with an inquiry into the unaccounted funds. Her personal attorney responded that she would cooperate. Whether charges would ultimately be filed was a question for the county attorney, not for me. I had given them everything I had. What happened next was theirs to decide. The tree planting happened on a Saturday in April. Irene and her team arrived at 7 a.m. with the 11 young oaks in burlap root balls, a soil amendment truck, and 3 crew members who worked quietly and precisely. Maya made coffee and brought it out. Sophia stayed home from her friend's house to be there. We stood back and watched as each tree went into the prepared holes, the same spots as close as the stumps would allow, where the originals had stood. By noon all 11 were in the ground, staked, watered, and beginning their slow return to the world. Tom came over after the planting, uninvited but welcome, with a 6-pack of local craft beer. We sat on my back steps and looked at the 11 young trees standing in the afternoon light, thin and new and barely reaching the second-story windows. He said, "Doesn't look like much yet." I said, "No." He said, "Will though?" I said, "Yeah." We opened the beers and sat in comfortable quiet, the way people sit when they've been through something difficult together and have come out the other side and don't need to narrate it. The legal fees were substantial. Rebecca had been extraordinarily fair. She had deferred a portion of her fees contingent on settlement recovery, which was how we managed. The settlement covered the bulk of it. There was a net, not life-changing but meaningful after all costs. I put most of it into Sophia's college savings. The rest went toward the landscaping. Maya said we should take a vacation. We booked a week in Montana for August. Not extravagant, just a cabin near a lake, the kind of week where you remember what quiet feels like when it's chosen. I ran into Linda at the grocery store in May. It was the first time I had been in close proximity to her without a legal proceeding involved. She was in the produce section. I was looking for cilantro. We ended up in the same aisle. She saw me. I saw her. She nodded. A single, tight nod. Nothing warm in it, but nothing hostile either. I nodded back. She put something in her cart and moved to the next aisle. That was it. 45 seconds of normalcy in a grocery store. I stood there for a moment holding my cilantro and thought, this is also an outcome. The return of ordinary life. The ordinariness of seeing someone you fought hard and finished right, and having it amount to a nod in a grocery store. Patricia's grievance committee finished its work in June. 41 homeowners had submitted claims for review. Of those, 27 were found to have valid claims for improper fines or assessments. The total remediation was $84,400 distributed across those 27 households from the fund established in the HOA settlement. The Garcias received $4,200 for the Magnolia, not enough to restore what had been taken, but acknowledgement that it had been wrongly taken. Mrs. Garcia sent the committee a handwritten thank you note. Patricia kept it framed in her office. Tom reorganized the HOA's enforcement structure from the ground up. The new process required 2 board members to approve any violation notice before it was sent. All inspections required 48 hours advance notice and could only be conducted by a licensed inspector. All bylaw amendments required 30 days notice and a 2/3 majority vote. All financial decisions over $5,000 required full board vote and public record. The new bylaws were posted on the HOA's website, which now had a website, a public one, with meeting minutes, budget reports, and a homeowner portal. Sunlight, as someone once said, is the best disinfectant. Marcus ran the first quarterly financial review under the new structure. He posted the full budget report to the homeowner portal with line item detail and a summary narrative explaining every significant expenditure. Tom told me afterward that 3 homeowners had emailed to thank the board for the transparency, something that had never happened before. When transparency becomes the norm, gratitude for it feels slightly absurd, which is exactly the right way for it to feel. That means it's becoming expected. That means it's working. Anika Patel proved to be the sleeper talent on the new board. She was quiet in meetings but precise. She had a background in urban planning that nobody had mentioned during the campaign, and she brought to HOA governance the kind of systematic thinking that Linda had always weaponized but never used constructively. Anika proposed a community improvement fund, separate from the maintenance budget, funded by voluntary homeowner contributions and dedicated to neighborhood beautification projects chosen by vote. The first project was new benches around the community lake. The vote was unanimous. The community lake. I had almost forgotten, through all of it, that the lake was real. Not just a symbol of Linda's ambition, but an actual body of water at the end of Maple Court that caught the afternoon light and was ringed by cattails and the occasional heron. I walked down there one evening in June alone, just to look at it without the weight of the preceding year. It was beautiful. It had always been beautiful. Linda had wanted to see it more clearly, and there is something almost human in that, the desire for a better view. The tragedy is what she had done to get it. Sophia did a summer research project on riparian ecosystems, the relationship between trees, root systems, and water quality in watersheds. She interviewed Irene, our landscaper, who had a graduate degree in environmental science, and spent an hour with Sophia talking about how oak root systems filter runoff before it reaches bodies of water like our community lake. The trees I had planted, the ones Linda had cut and the ones Irene had restored, were, in a very real ecological sense, protecting the lake. The view Linda wanted had been sustained, in part, by the very thing she had destroyed. I framed the settlement acknowledgement, the sworn public statement Linda had signed, and for about a week considered hanging it somewhere in the house. Then I decided against it. Not because it wasn't meaningful, but because hanging it would make it decorative, and what it actually was, a legal document, a factual record, a piece of the permanent public archive, didn't need decorating. I filed it in the binder, where it belongs. The county attorney's office concluded its review in the fall. It found insufficient evidence for criminal charges related to the unaccounted HOA funds. The forensic trail was not complete enough to prove personal enrichment beyond the improper stipend adjustments, which had already been addressed in the civil settlement. Some people in the neighborhood were disappointed by this. I was not particularly. The civil process had produced accountability. The public record existed. The oversight board's findings were permanent. The election had happened. I had wanted accountability. I had gotten it. Robert Fielding, the planning commissioner, had resigned before any criminal charges were filed against him either. The inspector general's report, which became public in the fall, documented his arrangement with Linda in detail and found it violated the county's ethics code. He was barred from public office for 5 years. He had also, the report noted, advanced the scenic corridor designation for Sycamore Ridge through 2 informal communications to committee staff that bypassed the normal public comment process. That designation was subsequently reviewed and rescinded. The corridor designation Linda had been building toward, the regulatory weapon she'd been quietly assembling for years, was gone. I thought often that fall about Linda's 9 years, about what she must have felt when she first became president. The sense of purpose, the genuine belief that she was the right person to maintain this neighborhood's standards. I'm not willing to say she was purely malicious from the start. What I think happened is more complicated and more human. She discovered she was good at power and that the systems around her allowed her to accumulate more of it, and that discovery, unchecked, turned something that might have been civic energy into something predatory. The absence of accountability is what turned competence into tyranny. But I don't dwell on that analysis too long, because the other truth, the one I live with more comfortably, is that what stopped her was not just me. It was Tom and Patricia and Marcus and Carolyn and Janet and George and Deborah on and the parking lot after. The forum and the chat group and the petition and Carolyn's phone call and Marcus's 11-page statement and the oversight board doing its job and a forensic IT firm finding backup logs that Linda thought were gone. It was a whole neighborhood, finally, refusing to be managed. Sycamore Ridge is quieter now in the best way. The HOA still sends notices, appropriate ones, about things like the annual insurance review and the pool opening date and the reminder to check smoke detectors. Tom writes them in plain language without the legalistic density Linda used to signal authority. People actually read them. The community calendar, once Linda's sole domain, is now posted publicly and updated by Anika. There are events on it I never knew could exist here. A neighborhood potluck, a kids' bike safety class, a native plant swap in October. Maya and I hosted the native plant swap at our house. People walked around the backyard, past the 11 young oaks staked in their places, admiring Irene's work and asking about the species. I explained about white oaks and root systems and watershed ecology. Sophia had taught me more than I'd bargained for. Several neighbors brought cuttings from their own gardens. We ended the afternoon with a yard full of strangers become familiar faces and more plants than any of us knew what to do with. It was exactly the kind of afternoon a neighborhood is supposed to produce. Linda did not attend the plant swap. She doesn't attend community events. But she still lives here, and I have had to make peace with that. Not in the sense of pretending it's comfortable, but in the sense of accepting it as the actual outcome. She lost her authority. She lost her position. She paid her legal obligations. She is here, living the private life that accountability leaves when public power has been stripped away. That is, in its way, a sufficient ending. Not a perfect one, but sufficient. I kept the promise. That's the thread I hold on to. Sophia asked me to promise, standing at the sliding glass door, looking at 11 stumps. I promised. I planted. I fought. I documented. I found the others who had their own documentation. I connected the dots and found the lawyers and attended every meeting and sat in courtrooms and spoke at the right moments and stayed quiet at the right moments. I kept the promise in every form it required. The trees are in the ground. They are alive. They are growing. Slowly, stubbornly, toward the light. There is one more thing I have not mentioned yet because it took until late in that first full year of new growth for me to fully understand it. The thing that Linda could not have predicted, the thing that none of us predicted actually, was that the fight had changed the neighborhood permanently for the better. Not just the governance, not just the finances, the character of the place. People here know each other's names now in ways they didn't before. They check on each other. The chat group Tom started is still active, full of ordinary, useful, neighborly things. What Linda's campaign of division had ultimately produced, through its own collapse, was community. I don't give her credit for that. The community was always there, latent, waiting for the conditions that would let it emerge. What Linda's reign had done was suppress it, through fear, through fines, through the management of information. What her fall had done was remove the suppression. What emerged underneath was what had always been there. People who lived in proximity and were capable of genuine care for one another. Linda hadn't created the neighborhood's smallness. She had just kept it from discovering its own size. In November, almost exactly 1 year after the tree removal, the new board dedicated the new lake benches. Tom made a short speech about the Community Improvement Fund and thanked Anika for the project. There were maybe 30 people there, standing by the lake in the late afternoon light, with coffee from the neighbors who'd brought thermoses. I stood with Maya and Sophia. The light came off the water the way it does in November, flat and gold and briefly perfect. Sophia leaned against me. We looked at the lake together. It was, I thought, a very fine view. From here, from where we were standing. I am writing this from my kitchen table, which is where I wrote most of the documentation, most of the emails, most of the things that ultimately mattered. The young oaks are visible through the window. They are 3 feet taller than they were at planting. The stumps of the originals are still there. Irene said it's best to leave them, that they'll rot naturally over years and feed the soil. She said the old root systems and the new ones will eventually intertwine underground. You won't be able to tell them apart. Sophia had a question for me last week that I have been thinking about ever since. She asked, "Dad, do you think Linda knows she was wrong?" I thought about the sworn acknowledgement she had signed. I thought about the grocery store nod. I thought about the 9 years and the chess game and the plan she'd written to herself in an email. I said, I think she knows she lost. Whether that's the same thing as knowing she was wrong, I honestly don't know. Sophia thought about this. Maybe it's enough, she said. I said maybe, and I left it there, which is where it belongs. The Oversight Board's formal report became, in a quiet way, a reference document for county HOA governance reform. 2 county supervisors cited it in a committee discussion about updating the state's Common Interest Development Act enforcement provisions. A nonprofit housing advocacy organization used portions of it in a policy brief. I was not involved in any of that. The document existed and it did what public documents do. It entered the record and stayed there. Linda's name is in it. My trees are in it. The whole year is in it, compressed into formal findings language that will outlast all of us. I still have the binder. It sits on the shelf in my home office, between a travel guide to Montana and Sophia's first-grade science fair project. I don't look at it often, but I know it's there, complete, organized, sourced. If anyone ever needs it, another neighborhood, another fight, another set of stumps where trees used to be, I know where it is. Knowing there is a different kind of peace than the kind you have before things go wrong. It's the peace of preparedness, of having learned what it takes. I would rather have the other kind of peace. But I'll take this one. The last time I spoke with Rebecca was for a coffee meeting 6 months after the settlement closed. She was already deep into 2 other cases. She has never had a shortage of clients. We talked about the HOA governance reform discussion and about how Carolyn had been invited to speak at a county homeowners conference about her experience as a dissenting board member. Rebecca said, "Most of these fights end with one person exhausted and one person entrenched. This one ended with a functioning institution." She raised her coffee cup in a quiet toast. I raised mine. Tom Okafor has been HOA president for almost 18 months now. He called me last month to ask my opinion on a landscaping question. A homeowner wanted to install raised garden beds in their front yard, and he wanted to know if the HOA's current guidelines were clear enough to handle the request fairly. I looked at the relevant section of the new bylaws and told him it was clear, that the process was well defined, and that he could approve it on the merits with confidence. He said, "Good." Then he said, "You know what's funny? I kind of like this job." I said I knew he would. Deborah, the woman who had moved away but come back with the voicemail, sent me a message in December. She had bought a house again, not in Sycamore Ridge, but in a nearby neighborhood. She said she had done the research this time, attended 2 HOA meetings before making an offer, reviewed the board minutes going back 3 years, spoken to 5 different homeowners. She said the neighborhood felt honest. She said she felt safe buying there. She asked if that was too small a thing to be proud of. I said no. I said it was exactly the right size. I have thought more than once about what I would do differently if I could go back. The answer is, start documenting sooner. Start connecting with the neighbors sooner. Find the Rebecca Choss of the world before you need them urgently. Build the binder before the crisis requires it. Attend the meetings before the agenda goes wrong. The lesson of all of this, reduced to its simplest form, is that communities are only as healthy as the attention their members pay to them. Attention is the cheapest and most powerful civic tool there is. Linda counted on inattention. She was right to count on it for a long time, until she wasn't. Maya finished the canvas she had been working on throughout the year. It took her the full duration. She added to it in stages, she told me, as each phase of the fight unfolded. What it depicts, in her soft and precise style, is the backyard as seen from the kitchen window, the stumps in their stark arrangement on one side, and the new young oaks staked in their places, and between them, in the center of the canvas, a pool of afternoon light falling on the soil where both things exist at once. Loss and restoration, occupying the same ground. She called it same yard. It's the best thing she's ever painted. It hangs in the living room where we can both see it from the couch. The community chat group had a milestone last week. 1 year since Tom created it. He posted a simple message, "Year 1. Thanks for showing up." And 83 people responded. Most of them just wrote something small. "Thanks for organizing," or "Glad we did this," or just a single emoji of a tree. Patricia wrote, "Best HOA in the county." Marcus wrote, "Low bar, but we'll take it." Carolyn wrote, "Here for year 2. Anika wrote a full paragraph about the native plant swap and the bench dedication and the things she hoped to propose in the coming year. I wrote, "Proud to be your neighbor." Every word was true. There is something I have carried quietly through all of this that I have not said out loud until now. When Linda stood at my property line and said, "You're welcome," when she looked at the butchered stumps of my trees and presented it as a gift, I felt something I still can't fully name. Not just anger, something older. The specific grief of watching someone you once lived peaceably beside reveal themselves as the person they were capable of being all along. You don't just lose the trees in that moment. You lose a version of the world you thought you were living in. But then, if you do the work, you build a more accurate one. I'm going to tell you something now that I kept out of the legal record because it wasn't relevant to the case, but it has stayed with me. The morning after the tree removal, before I called Rebecca, before I called Tom, I walked out into the backyard alone at 6 a.m. and stood among the stumps in the gray early light. And I talked to the trees. Out loud, softly, the way you talk to something that was alive. I thanked them for the years they gave us. I told them I was sorry I hadn't protected them. That might sound like grief, and it was. But it was also the moment I made the decision, not the tactical decision about lawyers and documentation, but the deeper one, that I would not let what she did just happen. That I would make it matter. Here is what mattered to me most by the end of everything. More than the money, more than the election, more than the public acknowledgement. The day the new oaks went into the ground, Sophia took a photograph of each one with her old film camera. She printed them herself at her school's darkroom. She made a small album, 11 photographs, one per tree, and she labeled each one with the date and its position in the yard. Northeast corner, southwest middle, near the fence. She gave it to me on my birthday with a card that said, "For the Promise Keeper." I keep the album on the same shelf as the binder. They belong next to each other. I want to be clear about one thing before I reach the end of this. Linda Marsh is not a monster. She is a person who discovered that systems can be bent by a determined hand and spent 9 years bending them to her will. What made her dangerous was not malice alone. It was competence combined with unchecked authority, combined with a community that had not yet found its voice. What stopped her was the opposite of all three: documentation, institutional accountability, and a neighborhood that finally spoke. The lesson is not beware the villain. The lesson is build systems that don't require heroism to survive. Because most neighborhoods won't get a year-long fight. They need the structure to hold without one. 6 weeks after the tree planting, I got a call from a reporter at a housing policy journal. She had read the newspaper coverage and the oversight board report and wanted to write a longer piece about the case as a model for HOA accountability reform. I said I would talk with her. I told her what you already know: the trees, the documentation, the neighbors, the election, the settlement. She asked what I would tell someone who was just beginning to notice that their HOA president was overstepping. I said, write it down. Write down everything with dates and save it somewhere that isn't just your computer. And then go find out who else has been writing things down. The reporter's article ran in the spring. It was thorough, well-sourced, and careful with names. My name was included. Linda's was referenced only as the former HOA president, per the editor's decision to protect against defamation liability. The article focused on the structural vulnerabilities in HOA governance that made cases like mine possible. Sole control of communications, self-approved bylaw amendments, insufficient state oversight. It was cited in the County Supervisor's Committee report. Rebecca sent me a copy with a sticky note that said simply, "This is the ripple." I've been asked, more than once in the year since, whether I would move. Whether staying in Sycamore Ridge with Linda still here, still walking her dog past my house, still existing in my peripheral vision was too much. The answer is no. I would not move. Not because I am indifferent to her presence, but because moving would be the wrong statement. This is my house, my yard, my 11 young oaks in their careful rows, my daughter's painted stones at the base of the stumps, my kitchen table where I did the work, my neighborhood now, mine and Tom's and Patricia's and Sophia's and the heron by the lake. I am not leaving it. Linda made one more move about 8 months after the settlement. She applied for a permit with the county to install a privacy fence along her backyard boundary. A tall one, 6 feet, close-boarded. The permit was approved. The fence went up in early spring. Several neighbors noted the irony. Linda Marsh, the woman who had wanted views at any cost, now voluntarily enclosing herself behind solid boards. Tom said maybe she was finally learning something about the value of privacy. I didn't say what I thought, but I thought she always knew the value of privacy. She just didn't think others deserved it. The fence Linda built is visible from my backyard. It runs along the boundary line, the corrected boundary line, 26 inches from where her old fence had stood. The new fence is exactly where it is supposed to be, not 1 inch onto my land. From where I stand, looking at my young oaks growing toward the height that will eventually restore the canopy, I can see the top of her fence. It is a fixed point in a changed landscape. I look at it sometimes and I feel the same thing I felt that first morning among the stumps. Not anger anymore, just the quiet awareness of what is mine and what is hers, clearly drawn, correctly measured, finally right. The HOA sent its first annual transparency report in January. Tom's idea, Patricia's execution. It included the budget, the audit summary, the grievance committee outcomes, and a neighborhood satisfaction survey in which 89% of respondents said they felt the HOA now operated fairly. The 11% who said otherwise were invited to attend the next town hall. 3 of them did. 2 left satisfied. 1 raised a legitimate concern about snow removal scheduling that became the first item on the February agenda. Democracy is slow and imperfect and occasionally about snow removal scheduling. That is exactly correct. I gave a brief talk at a local community association conference in March. Not a keynote, just a 15-minute panel discussion about HOA governance and homeowner rights. I spoke without notes. I told the story briefly and I made 2 points. Document everything and find your allies before you need them. Afterward, a man came up to me who was clearly distressed. Not aggressive, just frightened. He said his HOA had just fined him for a fence that had been there for 12 years and was now suddenly non-compliant. He looked like me a year ago, standing among the stumps. I gave him Rebecca's card. Rebecca told me last month that the man from the conference had become her client. His situation was different from mine in its specifics but identical in its structure. An HOA president using enforcement as a tool of personal preference rather than community governance. Rebecca said the documentation he'd started after our conversation had made her job significantly easier. She said, "You've become a very effective referral source." I said I'd rather not have the expertise. She said, "I know. But you do. I want to come back to the morning I stood among the stumps and talked to the trees, because there is a part of that morning I haven't shared yet. After I finished speaking to the trees, which felt at the time like something I would be embarrassed to admit and which I have since decided I am not embarrassed about, I sat down on the ground in the middle of the stumps and I thought about what kind of person I wanted to be when this was over. Not what I wanted to win, but what kind of person. I decided I wanted to be someone who fought clearly, without cruelty, and finished what he started. I think most of the time that is who I was. Linda's privacy fence is painted white. It's a good fence, honestly, well-built, properly set, plumb and level. Whoever she hired did good work. I have thought about knocking on her door and telling her that, and I have decided not to, because it would be a strange and probably unwelcome thing to do. But the thought of doing it is itself interesting to me, that after everything, my instinct is still toward the ordinary gesture of a neighbor noticing something done well. I am, it turns out, fundamentally a neighborly person. Linda is not. That might be the deepest difference between us. Tom called me in April to say that Derek, the youngest board member, the one who had secretly texted him during the oversight board crisis, had asked to join the HOA as a volunteer committee member. Not the board, just a committee. He wanted to help with the community garden Anika was proposing. Tom was uncertain whether to let him. He had voted, after all, for the canopy management initiative. He had gone along. I told Tom what I believed, that the question is not what someone did under a bad system, but what they do when the system changes. Tom put Derek on the garden committee. He's been, by Tom's account, genuinely useful. The community garden is taking shape in the northeast corner of the common area near the lake. 14 households have plots. Patricia grows tomatoes. Marcus grows collard greens and 3 kinds of hot pepper. Carolyn grows dahlias. Anika grows herbs she shares freely with anyone who asks. Tom grows nothing successfully, which he finds funny. I grow what Sophia picks. This year, cucumbers and 1 extremely ambitious squash vine. The garden is ridiculous and productive and communal in the way only things that feed people can be. It is my favorite thing the new board has done. Sophia is 12 now. She is doing a marine biology summer program at a university extension center 40 minutes from here. She leaves at 7 a.m. 3 days a week and comes home full of facts about bioluminescence and tidal zones and the nervous systems of cephalopods. She barely mentions the trees anymore. Not because she's forgotten, but because the new ones are simply part of the yard now. They are taller. They cast a small shade. In another year or 2, the tire swing might be possible again. She has not asked about the tire swing. But I have been thinking about it. I have a recurring dream. In the dream, the original oaks are still there, full and enormous, the canopy they had become after 11 years. I am standing underneath them with Maya and Sophia, and the light comes through the leaves the way it did on late summer afternoons, in patches and flickers. And Linda is on the other side of the fence, looking through the leaves at the lake beyond. In the dream, I feel no anger, just the strange, complicated piece of sharing a world with someone who once tried to take part of yours. I wake from this dream calmly, which I think means something is healing, even in the part of me that isn't over it yet. The county finally completed the review of the scenic corridor designation in the fall. With Robert Fielding gone and his informal advocacy removed from the record, the designation failed to meet the formal criteria for protection status under the county's land use code. It was rescinded without fanfare, in a brief administrative notice posted to the county's website. No story in the paper. No announcement in the neighborhood. The thing Linda had been quietly building for 4 years, the regulatory weapon that would have given her permanent authority over vegetation on adjacent properties, simply ceased to exist. Formally, permanently, gone. I found out about the rescission through the county's public notices database, which I still check every few weeks. Old habit. I looked at the entry, 3 lines, bureaucratic language, effective date, and thought, this is what most justice looks like. Not courtroom drama. Not a moment of public reckoning. A 3-line administrative notice on a county website at 2 p.m. on a Thursday. Linda had spent 4 years building something, and it was unmade in a paragraph. I copied the notice into the binder. Last entry. Tab F. I closed the binder after that. Literally, I had left it on my desk for months, technically open, just in case. I closed it. I put it on the shelf. I looked at it for a moment sitting there between the Montana Travel Guide and Sophia's Science Fair project. And I thought, this is what a completed thing looks like. Not a trophy. Not a monument. A closed binder on a shelf, full of evidence of a fight that ended the right way. That is enough. More than enough. The summer before Sophia turned 13, we planted a garden together in the backyard. Flowers, mostly, in the spaces between the young oaks. She chose the varieties. Black-eyed Susans, coneflowers, bee balm, wild ginger. Native plants, she explained, because they're better for the watershed. She knew exactly what she was doing with the space. She arranged the plants around the remaining stumps so that the flowers grew up through and around the decaying wood. She called it growing through the evidence. She did not explain what she meant. She didn't need to. Here's the thing about oaks. They are slow. White oaks grow roughly 1 foot per year under good conditions. less in stressed soil, more with proper care. In 5 years, the ones Irene planted will be approaching the height of the roofline. In 10 years, they will begin to feel like trees. In 20, they will feel like they have always been there. In 50, they will be what the originals were. I am 39 years old. If I am lucky, I will see them at 20 years growth. Sophia will see them at 50. Her children may see them at 100. The most permanent thing I did this year was put 11 trees in the ground. Tom sent me a photo last week of the new lake benches with people sitting on them. 4 different households, kids and adults, on a weekday afternoon. Nobody who arranged to be there. Just neighbors converging at the lake the way neighbors are supposed to, because there was somewhere to sit. He texted, "Linda built things for her view. We built something for everyone to sit down." It was not a subtle message. It was also not wrong. I think about Tom's text sometimes. Built something for everyone to sit down. And what it means about the different kinds of power available to people who live in close proximity. Linda had power and she used it to narrow the world. Fewer views for others, more for herself. Fewer voices in the meeting, more authority for her own. Fewer neighbors with full use of their property, one president with increasing dominion over all of them. What the new board had done was the exact inverse. Expanded the world, made it roomier, shared the sitting down. It sounds almost too simple as a philosophy of governance. But it isn't simple at all to sustain. It requires constant attention. They are paying it. What Linda never understood, what I think she was constitutionally unable to understand, is that the view she wanted was always going to be better shared. That a lake at the end of a neighborhood is most beautiful when there is a community around it that has taken care of it together. That the oaks filtering the runoff into that lake made it cleaner. That the neighbors talking to each other across the community garden made it safer. That the bulletin board full of lost cats and plumber recommendations was the substance of the thing she claimed to be protecting. She managed the surface and hollowed out the center. We got the center back. I don't think about Linda every day. That is a change from the year of the fight, when she was the first thing I thought about in the morning and the last thing at night. Now she appears in my mind occasionally, when I see the fence from the backyard, or when something happens in the neighborhood that makes me think about what it was like before. But she is no longer the organizing principle of my attention. My attention has moved on to things that deserve it. The oaks, the garden, Sophia's growing up, Maya's canvases, Tom's governance texts, the slow, ordinary accumulation of a good life in a place that is, finally, actually ours. Rebecca sent me a Christmas card. In the card she wrote, "Some cases leave the law better than they found it. This one did." I read that twice. The law, in our case, had been used well and had held. The restraining order, the discovery process, the subpoenas, the oversight board's statutory authority, the public record requirement. None of it was perfect or fast or painless. But it had worked when activated by the right combination of documentation, persistence, and people willing to put their names on statements. The law does not self-activate. That is its greatest weakness and its deepest truth. It requires someone to pull the lever. I pulled the lever. So did Rebecca. So did Marcus with his 11-page statement. So did Carolyn with her phone calls. So did Patricia with her color-coded folder. So did Tom with the chat group and the petition. So did Janet, who made one phone call she was afraid to make. So did Deborah On, who saved a voicemail and drove to a stranger's house to play it. So did the County Oversight Board, doing exactly the job the legislature had designed them to do. So did a forensic IT firm that found backup logs in a server Linda thought she had wiped clean. When enough people pull enough levers at once, even 9 years of accumulated power gives way. I have started writing down what I know, not for a case but for the record. A guide of sorts, though I resist that word because a guide implies I have answers I'm not sure I have. More like a document of what worked and what I wish I had known at the start, and what the people in my position should know before the chainsaws arrive. I have been adding to it slowly over months at the same kitchen table. I don't know what I'll do with it. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. I am in no hurry to decide. There is a moment I keep returning to. Not a dramatic one. Not the settlement signing or the election results or the oversight board findings. The moment I keep returning to is Sophia, age 11, standing at the sliding glass door looking at the stumps, asking me if I promised. That question required something of me that none of the legal strategy required. It required that I mean something before I knew the outcome. I had no idea at that moment whether any of this would work. The legal arguments were untested. The neighbors were unmobilized. The documentation was still being gathered. She asked me to promise. And the only honest answer was yes. That's the kind of yes that costs something. I have been back in contact with the county's environmental office about the replanted oaks, specifically about the watershed protection protocols for the root zone. They assigned us a case file number, which means the replanting and its environmental context is now part of the county's formal record. The oaks are documented. Their presence in the watershed zone is documented. Their purpose is documented. If anyone ever tries to remove them again, they will not just be removing trees. They will be removing a documented part of a protected ecological system. I built a paper trail around my trees the way you build a fence around something precious. I asked Irene, the landscaper, about what happens to the old stumps as the new oaks grow. She explained that the old root systems, as they decay, create channels and organic material in the soil that the new roots will follow and use. The new trees, she said, will grow through the same underground paths the old ones carved. They'll be in conversation, she said, and then looked like she was surprised by her own phrasing. I told her it was exactly right. The old trees and the new trees in conversation underground. That is the most precise description of what this whole year has been about that I have ever heard from anyone. The day Linda's encroaching fence came down and the new one went up on the correct boundary line, I stood at my side window and watched. The crew that came was professional, efficient. They pulled the old posts, filled the holes, set the new posts 26 inches further into Linda's yard, and hung the new boards. Took 4 hours. When they were done, I walked out and stood at the new line, looked at where the old fence had been, and then looked at where I now stood. 26 inches. The width of roughly 2 of my steps. A distance most people would call negligible. It was not negligible. It was mine. The morning after the new fence line was set, I planted 3 lavender bushes along that edge. Not for any strategic reason. Just because I had been meaning to plant lavender there for years and had never done it, and now the boundary was right and the ground was recently turned and lavender is what I wanted. They are blooming now. They smell like the right ending to a complicated sentence. Sophia picked a handful of the flowers last summer and hung them upside down in her room to dry. For the smell, she said, and because things that grow back are worth keeping. I have one regret. Not about the fight was necessary and I would fight it the same way. My regret is simpler. I regret not connecting with my neighbors sooner, not in the context of the fight, but in the context of just being a neighbor. Tom Okafor lived across the street for 3 years before we had a real conversation. Patricia Sung was 2 streets over for 4 years before I knew her name. Marcus Webb had been on the HOA board and left it in anguish before I even knew he existed. These were people worth knowing. The crisis introduced us. We could have introduced ourselves to each other years earlier, and all of us would have been better positioned and better friend for it. If I could go back to the beginning, not to stop Linda but to start earlier, I would show up at the first HOA meeting in my 2nd month in the neighborhood. I would introduce myself to Tom, to Patricia, to Marcus, to Carolyn. I would bring something to share. I would sit in the room and listen and learn who the people were before anyone started asking anything of me. I would have built the relationships that the crisis eventually forced, in the ordinary time before the extraordinary one arrived. I would have been a neighbor first, a fighter second. In that order, because fighting for something is harder, and the something is more worth fighting for when you already know who you're fighting alongside. Here is what I have not told you yet, and what I have been building toward. Everything I have described, the documentation, the legal fight, the election, the settlement, the replanting, all of it was one kind of reckoning. Public one. A systematic one. But there was a private moment, separate from all of it, that I have kept until now. It happened on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the new oaks were planted, on an ordinary night when Maya was at a gallery opening and Sophia was at her friend's house and I was alone. I was sitting on my back steps with a glass of water, watching the young oaks in the late evening light. They were just stakes with leaves at that point, so small, so fragile against the massive absence of what had been there before. And I heard someone at the fence line. I turned. Linda was there at the new fence, standing at the gap in the fence where the gate would eventually be installed. She was not in the yard. She was on her side. But she was looking at the oaks. She didn't know I was on the steps. The light was behind me. I could see her clearly and she couldn't see me well. She stood there for a long time, 60 seconds, maybe 90, looking at the 11 small trees. Her expression was something I had not seen on her face before. Not anger, not calculation, not the composed presentation she wore in public. She looked like someone looking at a consequence, like someone standing in front of something they had done and could not undo and had to live next to forever. I stood up. She saw me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she said, "They're small." I said, "They'll grow." She nodded, a single, slow nod that was nothing like the tight, controlled nods of the past. She turned and walked back toward her house. She did not say anything else.
I wanted to go.
I sat back down on the steps. I thought about what had just happened, which was nothing and also everything. She had come to look at what she had done. That is not nothing. I do not know what to make of it, finally. But it happened and it was real and I think it matters. The next morning I told Maya about the fence line moment. She listened without saying anything until I finished. Then she said, "What do you think she felt?" I said I didn't know. I said it had looked like something heavy. Maya said, "I wonder if that's the closest she'll ever get to apologizing." I thought about the sworn public acknowledgement Linda had signed. I thought about the retraction letter. I thought about standing there in the fading light, watching her look at 11 small trees. I said, Maybe it's the closest she can get." Maya was quiet. Then she said, "I hope it's enough for her." I thought that was the kindest thing I'd heard anyone say about Linda Marsh. It might have been the truest. What does it mean to make someone pay for what they've done? In the legal sense, the settlement answered this. In the civic sense, the election answered this. In the regulatory sense, the oversight board answered this. But in the human sense, the one that operates at the level of a woman standing at a fence line looking at small trees, I am not sure anything can fully answer it. Accountability and reckoning are related but not the same. We achieved accountability. Whether Linda experienced reckoning, whether she looked at those trees and felt something shift in her understanding of herself, is something only she knows. I have stopped needing to know. Sophia and I built the tire swing in September. We used a thick rope I ordered and a pre-made disc seat that Irene had recommended, and we spent a Saturday morning finding the right branch on the strongest of the new oaks. Still a young branch, we knew, and we selected carefully for weight distribution. We hung it low, appropriate for the tree's current strength. Sophia tested it first, swinging in slow arcs while I held the rope and the tree did its job. She said, "It's not as high as the old one yet." I said, "Give it 5 years." She smiled, a real one, uncomplicated. "Deal," she said. The County Inspector General's final report on Robert Fielding was released publicly that fall. It ran to 67 pages. I read all of it on a Saturday afternoon. The report documented the arrangement between Fielding and Linda in granular detail: dates of meetings, emails, the specific quid pro quo of clubhouse access for planning information. It concluded that Fielding had violated the county's ethics code and had improperly influenced two separate land use decisions benefiting Sycamore Ridge in exchange for personal hospitality benefits. His 5-year bar from public office was confirmed. The Scenic Corridor decision was listed as one of the 2 affected land use matters. Nowhere in the Inspector General's report was Linda charged with a crime. She was named as a party to the arrangement, but the report classified her conduct as a private citizen's improper solicitation of government advantage, actionable under civil and administrative law, but not criminally charged in this instance. Her attorney had navigated carefully. She had avoided criminal exposure by the narrowest of margins, and, I suspect, by having prepared for this possibility long before anyone started investigating. She was, as I had always known, very skilled at self-preservation. It just hadn't been enough. I made one final trip to see Rebecca 2 weeks after the Inspector General's report was released. We met at her office rather than a coffee shop, more formal, which felt appropriate for a closing. She had the full case file on her desk, several inches thick in its own right. She said, "How are you?" I said genuinely, "Better than I expected to be." She said, "You know this doesn't end with a bow, right? These things rarely do." I said I knew. She said, "But it ended as well as cases like this can end, which is better than most." I thanked her for everything. She said, "Thank the binder." I drove home from Rebecca's office through the neighborhood, the long way around Maple Court, so I passed the lake. The afternoon light was doing something extraordinary. Flat and gold and refracted through the bare-limbed trees at the water's edge. The way light does in late November when the angle is just right and everything briefly looks exactly like itself. I parked the car for a moment. I looked at the lake. The benches were empty. The cattails were dry and pale at the edges. The heron that sometimes visits was not there today, but the space where it stands was familiar. I thought, Linda wanted this. All of this for herself, controlled and contained and seen from the right angle with the right view. And here it is, for anyone who drives past and stops. There is a particular quality to the light through oak leaves. A greenish, filtered, moving quality that I don't know the name for but have been looking for in every other tree I've seen since the removal. Maples don't have it. Elms don't have it. It's specifically the white oak's leaf shape, the way it diffuses and freckles the light that comes through it, that creates the thing. The young oaks don't produce it yet. They are too small, their canopy too sparse. But on clear mornings when the angle is right, I can sometimes catch a hint of it, the beginning of that quality returning. It fills me with something I could call hope if I were being sentimental, which I am, so I will. I want to say something about patience, which is the virtue this entire year demanded of me in quantities I did not know I had. Not the passive patience of waiting for things to improve on their own, but the active patience of a process, of building a case document by document, of attending meetings that felt interminable, of letting Rebecca file and wait, of watching the oversight board move at institutional speed while Linda moved at personal speed. Of trusting that the slower thing would eventually outrun the faster one because it was built on ground that didn't shift. Patient the way you are patient when you know you are right but you do not yet have what you need to prove it. That kind of patience is not peaceful. But it works. Tom sent me the new HOA newsletter for December. It is 4 pages long, clearly written, with photos of the garden and the lake benches and a note from each board member. Tom's note talks about community trust and what it takes to build and maintain it. Patricia's note is about the financial audit and what the new reporting structure will look like going forward. Marcus's note is about the grievance committee's completion and the fund distribution. Carolyn's note is about the upcoming native plant initiative for the common areas. Anika's note is about the garden expansion in spring. It reads like a neighborhood talking to itself about what it values. That is what a newsletter is supposed to be. The December issue of the newsletter included, on the back page, a short note from a longtime Sycamore Ridge homeowner that the editors had decided to include without identifying the author. The note read, "I have lived in this neighborhood for many years and made decisions I believed were right for the community. I understand now that some of those decisions caused harm to my neighbors. I regret that harm. I hope this neighborhood continues to grow in the direction it is now heading." It was not signed. Anika told me later that it had been submitted by Linda. She had asked that it be published anonymously. The board had voted to include it. I read Linda's anonymous note 3 times. I had not been told it would be in the newsletter. I sat with it for a long time. It was not an apology, not a full one, not a named one. But it was something. She had chosen to put something into the record, into the community's communication, that was not about her view or her authority or her 9 years. It was about harm. The word harm was in there. Regret was in there. She had written it and submitted it knowing that the board, who knew who she was, would read it. That is not nothing. I have decided to accept it as not nothing. I told Maya about the anonymous note. She read it when I showed her the newsletter. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "She couldn't sign it." I said I knew. Maya said, "But she wrote it." I said I knew that too. We sat with it. Maya said, "I think that's the best she can do." I said maybe. She said, "Is it enough for you?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "It's more than I expected." She nodded and handed the newsletter back. We had dinner. Sophia told us about bioluminescent plankton. The evening was ordinary and good. The oaks are dormant now in their first winter. Dormancy is not death. The trees are alive, pulling water slowly, storing energy, consolidating root growth they'll need in spring. You can't see it. The yard looks still, the stakes barely visible in the pale January light. But underground, things are moving. The roots of 11 new trees reaching deeper, spreading wider, finding each other and finding the channels the old roots left. The conversation Irene described is happening in the dark. It is happening whether I watch for it or not. I have learned that I am a person who keeps promises. This seems like a small thing to learn at 39. But I had not been tested on it. Not like this, not for this long, not at this cost. I now know that when someone I love asks me if I promise, something in me clicks into alignment with the answer. Not bravado, not performance, just the fact of it. I promised. I did the thing. The thing is done. The promise is kept. That is a complete sentence. It is the most important one in this entire story. There is a homeowner on Birch Court, a new one, who moved in 6 months ago, who came to Tom's first open office hour and asked about the HOA's enforcement process. She had heard something had happened with the previous leadership and wanted to understand how things worked now. Tom walked her through the new bylaws, the transparent grievance process, the public meeting structure. She nodded, looked reassured, and said, "So it's actually run fairly?" Tom said yes. She said, "Good, because I was almost afraid to move here." Tom told me the story. I thought, there it is. That is the thing we built. Not afraid to move here. That is what 9 years of Linda Marsh had cost. The sense of safety in a place where safety is one of the basic premises. A neighborhood that runs fairly is not exciting. It does not make news. It does not produce fights or lawsuits or federal inquiry. It produces a woman on Birch Court who is not afraid to move somewhere and who will not spend years defending her property against the person who is supposed to protect it. That is the thing. That is the goal. That's what all of it was for. Sophia asked me in January what the most important thing I learned from all of this was. She asked it the way she asks questions now, directly with real interest, not expecting a simple answer. I thought about all the things I could say. Document everything, build relationships before crises, trust institutional processes when you can activate them, find the Rebecca Chauce of the world. All of those are true. But the most important thing, the thing I would want her to carry, is simpler. I said, when something is wrong and you can see it clearly, don't wait for someone else to say so first. She thought about that. Then she said, but what if you say so and nothing happens? I said something will always happen. It might not be what you expect, and it might be slow, and it might not be enough. But saying so clearly with documentation to the right people with persistence is the first movement of every correction that has ever occurred in human institutions. The correction doesn't start until someone says, this is wrong, and here is why, and here is the evidence. Everything after that is slower and harder and more uncertain. But it starts there. It starts with one person deciding to say so. She nodded slowly. I think she understood. The tire swing moves in the wind on winter days when Sophia is at school. I can see it from my office window, turning slightly, the rope twisting and releasing. The tree it hangs from is the strongest of the 11, the one Irene chose specifically for its root structure, the one that went deepest fastest in its first season. It stands slightly apart from the others, slightly taller already. Sophia says it looks like it's in charge. I say it's just the one that got the best spot. She says those are the same thing. She might be right. The special thing about this neighborhood now, the thing I could not have described to you at the start of this story because it didn't exist yet, is that it feels inhabited. Not just occupied, inhabited. People are present to each other here in ways they weren't before. They notice things. They speak up. They use the chat group to ask if anyone has a ladder or knows a good electrician or wants extra zucchini from the garden. These are small things. They are also the substance of a community. The substance Linda's management had replaced with rules and fines and fear. The substance is back. I want to be honest about something difficult. There were moments in the year of the fight when I was not the person I want to be. Moments when I was so focused on the strategic next step that I forgot to be present at home. Moments when I was sharp with Maya when I should have been soft. Moments when I checked my legal documents instead of sitting with Sophia during homework time. The fight consumed me, and I am aware that my family paid a portion of the cost that won't show up in any settlement amount. I am grateful they stayed present through it. I owe them years of ordinary presence in return. I am working on it. Maya's same yard painting sold, actually. A woman at the gallery where it was shown offered to buy it, and Maya said yes without telling me first. I was startled when she mentioned it. Not hurt, just surprised. She said, someone needed it more than our living room does. She used the sale price to buy supplies for a new series she's working on. Landscapes of the neighborhood, one per season, the same angle through the same window. The first one shows the young oaks in spring light. The second shows them in summer heat. She is working on autumn now. I don't know what she will do with the series when it's finished. I don't need to know yet. Here is a thing about living next to someone you have fought in every institutional venue available to you. The mundane continues. The mail still comes. The garbage still goes out on Tuesday. The seasons change and the lawn needs mowing and the school year starts and the holidays approach, and none of it waits for the emotional resolution of the larger story. You carry both things simultaneously, the weight of what happened and the ordinary forward motion of a life, and eventually, gradually, the weight becomes smaller in proportion to the motion. Not gone. Smaller. That is what healing looks like in a place you are staying. Tom brought me something in February that I didn't expect. He had been going through the HOA's archived records as part of the board's operational review, and he found the original welcome letter that the HOA had sent to every new homeowner in 2020, including me. It was signed by Linda. It described Sycamore Ridge as a community built on trust, mutual respect, and shared care for our neighborhood. Tom had highlighted those words. He handed it to me without comment. I read it twice. I thought, she believed those words when she wrote them, or she should have. Somewhere between the believing and the presidency, something went wrong. The words were right. The execution was the betrayal. Sophia had a school assignment in March. Write about a person who influenced you and what you learned. She chose me. I know because she read it to us at dinner before she turned it in. She wrote about the trees and the fight and the promise, but the thing she focused on, the thing that surprised me, was the documentation. She wrote about the binder. She described it as my dad's way of making sure the truth couldn't be argued away. Her teacher wrote in the margin, "Powerful insight. The pen can be mightier than the chainsaw." Sophia was very pleased with this note. I was too. The last thing Tom did as part of the board's first year of operation was commission a small plaque for the new lake benches. The plaque reads, "Dedicated to the residents of Sycamore Ridge, who this lake belongs to." He showed me the proof before it was installed. I read it and said it was right. He said Linda had suggested a plaque 2 years ago. She had wanted it to say, "Donated by the Sycamore Ridge HOA under the leadership of Linda Marsh." He had found that proposal in the archived records. I looked at Tom's version and then looked at what hers would have been. The difference is everything. The plaque was installed on a Thursday in April. I walked down to see it the evening after it went up. The lake was reflecting the late sky, all lavender and gray, the way it gets in early spring before the trees fill in. I sat on one of the benches. Not the bench with the plaque, just a bench. I sat there and I looked at the lake for a while. A heron landed at the far edge and stood very still in the shallows. We coexisted without disturbing each other. I thought about the scenic corridor that no longer existed. I thought about the trees that were gone and the trees that were growing. I thought about promises and oaks and how slowly the right things come back. And then the heron lifted off and I went home for dinner. In May, a year and a half after the tree removal, the HOA planted 24 native trees in the common area around the lake, a project Anika had championed through the Community Improvement Fund, red maples, serviceberries, American hornbeam. They were professionally installed, properly permitted, environmentally assessed, and documented in the HOA's public records with their species, locations, and planting dates. They belong to everyone. They were chosen for their ecological value: root depth, watershed protection, wildlife habitat. They are, in the driest technical sense, exactly what my oaks had been. But they are here for a different reason. They are here because the neighborhood voted. Sophia measured the oaks in June, 14 months after planting. She used a measuring tape and a homemade height marking stake, and she recorded each tree's height in her field notebook. Average growth, 14 inches in the first year. Right on schedule, Irene had said. Maybe a little ahead. Sophia made a chart hand-drawn with colored pencil. She taped it to the refrigerator, titled, "The Oaks, Year 1. There is space at the bottom for years 2 through 20. I looked at that chart and felt the specific gravity of a long game measured in inches. I felt extremely, unaccountably well. The morning I am writing this is a Saturday in late summer. The yard is full of light. The oaks are 2 feet taller than they were at planting. I can see them from the kitchen window, greening into their second season, the leaves catching the morning breeze with a sound that is just beginning, the sound I remember from before. The stumps are low now, settling into the lawn, beginning the long return to soil. Sophia's painted stones are still there, colors faded from 2 winters of weather. They will fade entirely eventually, but they were there when it mattered. Linda's fence is white in the summer morning light. I look at it sometimes without feeling anything in particular. That is progress. 2 summers ago, I could not look at that fence without the full weight of the year coming back. Now it is just a fence. White, plumb, correctly placed. Her choice, her property. Ours properly bounded. The world on each side of that line is the world that was always supposed to be there. We just had to fight to restore it. The tire swing is in use this morning. Sophia is out there in it, spinning slowly, a book open on her lap though she's not reading it. She's looking up through the canopy, such as it is, of the young oak she's hanging from. The light comes through the leaves in a way that is the beginning, just the beginning of that freckled, filtered, greenish quality I described. You would not notice it unless you were looking for it. I am looking for it. It's there. I have reached the end of this account. Not the end of the neighborhood or the oaks, or the fight's long echo in the community, those continue. But the end of the telling. I have tried to tell it honestly. The anger and the strategy, the moments of doubt and the moments of clarity, the people who helped and the person who didn't and what it all eventually amounted to. I have tried not to make myself larger in it than I was, and not to make Linda smaller than the full, complicated person she is. She was a capable person who used her capability wrongly. I was an ordinary person who refused to let that be the final outcome. The gap between those two facts is where this whole story lived. There is something I have thought about saying throughout this account and held back until now. I never hated Linda Marsh. That surprises people when I say it. I was furious. I was determined. I was, at several points, something close to relentless. But what I felt toward Linda was not hate. It was a kind of cold, clear refusal to accept what she had done as permanent. Hate would have made me want to destroy her. What I wanted was to restore what she had taken. Those are very different projects, and they lead to very different outcomes. The oaks will outlive all of us. This is the thing about planting trees. You are making an argument for the future in the most concrete possible terms. You are saying, with your hands and your shovel and the $47,000 of settlement money and the 5-year growth guarantee from Irene's nursery, that the future is worth investing in. That the ground you stand on deserves to be tended. That the people who come after you, Sophia at 50, her children at 100, deserve to stand under a canopy that someone, in the difficult year of 2024, decided was worth planting. I made that argument. The trees are making it still, quietly, in the soil, every day. The final item in the binder, tab F, the scenic corridor rescission, is dated the same month as the first tree measurement Sophia made. That timing was not planned but feels correct to me now. The thing Linda built to take what wasn't hers, rescinded in the same month that what was mine proved it was growing back. The legal deletion and the biological return, occurring simultaneously, recorded in the same binder on adjacent tabs. The binder doesn't know that this is poetic. But I do. Here is what I know now that I did not know at the beginning. Accountability is not a single moment. It is an accumulation. It is the police report and the arborist valuation and the court filing and the forensic IT report and the oversight board findings and the election and the settlement and the anonymous note in the newsletter and the fence on the correct line and the trees in the ground and Sophia's measurement chart on the refrigerator. All of these together, and not one of them alone, constitute the thing. People look for the moment of reckoning, the dramatic turn, the public shaming, the one instance of consequence. But accountability is built the way trees grow. Slowly, in layers, underground as much as above, and measured in years. I will tell you one final thing about Linda that I have not told you. Several months after the settlement, I received a piece of mail forwarded to me by the county assessor's office. It had been addressed to me incorrectly and routed to Linda's address by mistake. She could have discarded it. She could have opened it. Instead, she placed it in a sealed envelope, wrote my address on the outside in her precise handwriting, and put it in my mailbox. No note. No explanation. Just a correctly forwarded piece of mail. I stood at my mailbox holding it for a long moment. This is not redemption. But it is a data point. People are more complicated than their worst actions. That is uncomfortable and important and true. The kitchen table where I am writing this is the same table where I built the binder, drafted the chronology, had conversations with every neighbor who came through my door in the year of the fight. It is scratched and needs refinishing. I am not refinishing it. It looks like what it is. A table where work happened, hard and important work, at all hours of the day and night, with coffee and legal pads and a laptop that still has a folder on the desktop labeled HOA, do not delete. I am not deleting it. Not yet. I want to close by saying something about what it means to fight for a place you live in. Not fight as in argue or contend or pursue legal remedies, though all of that is included. Fight as in invest yourself completely in the truth of a thing at personal cost over time with no guarantee of the outcome, because the alternative is to let wrong be permanent. That is what this year required of me. I did not know I was capable of it until it was required. I am glad I did not find out another way. The new oaks are not the old oaks. They will never be exactly the old oaks. They are a restoration which is different from the original and honest about the difference. A restoration says, something was lost here and we chose to grow it back, and we carry both the loss and the growth simultaneously, and we do not pretend the loss did not happen. The stumps are still in the ground. We planted around them. That is the most truthful thing I can think of to do with damage. Not erase it. Grow around it. Let the new things find the channels the old ones carved. Sophia will be a scientist. I know this the way you know things about your children that they have not yet confirmed formally. Through the quality of her questions, the precision of her notebooks, the way she measures the oaks every June with the same careful seriousness she brings to every system she decides to understand. She will study something I cannot fully predict, and she will bring to it the same instinct she brought to those 11 painted stones at the base of the stumps. The instinct to mark the things that matter so they are not forgotten, and then to grow something living in the same space. Tom Okafor told me last week that he has started receiving calls from HOA boards in other communities who want to understand how Sycamore Ridge restructured its governance. Not calls from homeowners fighting bad presidents. Calls from board members who want to build something better before it breaks. This is the version of the ripple I had not imagined. Not people in crisis reaching out, but people in relative calm reaching out, wanting to build the structure that prevents the crisis. That is the best possible direction for this to travel. Prevention, not response. I ran the loop around Sycamore Ridge again this morning for the first time in months. Past the stumps. Past the young oaks. Past Tom's driveway. Past Patricia's garden, brilliant in the morning light. Past the Garcia house where the magnolia was forced out years ago and where a new magnolia, planted by the Garcias themselves the spring after the grievance committee check arrived, is now 3 feet tall and flowering for the first time. Past the lake where the heron was back in the shallows. Past Linda's house, curtains open this morning, and Linda visible at her kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, looking out. We saw each other briefly through the glass. I ran past. Carolyn Duffy retired from the board in September. Her health had been declining and she needed to step back from the demands of the role she had held for so long. The board threw her a small party at Patricia's house. I was invited and I went. Carolyn, who had once called me privately to apologize on behalf of a board she had no power to control, sat at Patricia's kitchen table surrounded by people who had no idea how much she had contributed to what had changed. She looked tired and at peace. I sat next to her for a while. I told her that her phone call early in the fight had been one of the things that told me I was not wrong. She said, "I should have called sooner." I said, "You called. That was enough." The winter before this summer, Sophia's 12th winter, the second winter of the New Oaks, we had a significant ice storm. 2 inches of ice on everything. The young oaks bent under the weight of it, dramatically. Their thin trunks curved low to the ground. I stood at the window in the early morning looking at them, anxious in a way I hadn't felt since the legal fight. Irene had warned me this could happen. She had said young oaks bend, they are designed to bend, and that bending was not breaking. By noon, as the ice melted, they had returned upright, one by one, until all 11 were standing again, untouched. Irene texted me that afternoon. "How did they do?" I said, "They bent. They came back." She said, "That's what they do." That is, I think, the best possible ending to this story. Not the settlement, not the election, not the regulatory findings, not even Sophia's measurement chart, but 11 young oaks bending in an ice storm and returning upright in the afternoon. Because it is not a human ending. It is a natural one. The trees don't care about Linda Marsh or HOA governance or the binder or the courthouse. They care about water and light and soil. They will do what oaks do. Grow slowly, root deeply, outlast everything. They are doing it right now, this minute, while I write this and while Linda makes her morning coffee and while Tom chairs his board meeting and while Sophia measures things and takes notes. The trees are just growing. That finally is exactly right. The heron was at the lake again yesterday evening, standing absolutely still at the water's edge for 40 minutes while the light changed around it. I watched from the bench, the one with the plaque this time. The heron does not know it stands on common ground that was nearly made private. It does not know that the trees filtering the runoff into the water that holds its fish were once removed and then replanted. It does not know about Linda or the oversight board or Carolyn's phone call. It only knows the quality of the water and the availability of the fish and the stillness that lets it hunt. That ignorance is pure and instructive. The lake is good because people decided it should be. The heron benefits without knowing why. Most things work this way. I think I have been writing toward a conclusion about what neighborhoods are, what they are underneath the governance and the disputes and the property lines and the fines and the fights, what they are at the level of the heron not knowing but benefiting. And what I have arrived at is this. A neighborhood is a bet that people make on each other, silently and mostly unconsciously, every day. When you choose to live near other people rather than alone, you are betting that the proximity will produce something worth the compromise. Most of the time, if the bet is tended, it pays. The tending is the work. The tending is everything. Linda had stopped tending and started collecting. She turned the bet into a ledger and put herself in charge of who was in credit and who was in debt. When that happens, when the person managing the common bet starts using it for personal gain, the bet itself begins to fail. Not all at once. Gradually. In the fines that don't make sense and the meetings nobody is notified of and the trees that get cut on private property without permits. The failure is legible if you are paying attention. And the correction, if people start paying attention together, is possible. We paid attention together. We corrected it. The bet is paying again. Here is my final accounting. I lost 11 oak trees that had taken 11 years to grow. I gained an attorney who taught me how institutions work and how to use them. I gained Tom, Patricia, Marcus, Carolyn, Anika, Janet, George, Deborah, Irene. I gained 11 new oaks that are beginning their own 11 years. I gained the knowledge that I am the kind of person who keeps his promises. I gained a neighborhood that governs itself fairly and a daughter who knows that when something is wrong, the correct response is to say so, clearly with documentation and not stop. These are not small things. They are, in fact, almost everything. And Linda, what did Linda gain? I have thought about this. She gained a fence that gives her privacy. She gained a view of the lake that she now shares with a neighborhood that can look at it from benches. She gained the knowledge. I believe she gained it, standing at the fence line looking at 11 small trees, that the world does not accommodate a single will indefinitely. She gained a smaller life than the one she had built, and within that smaller life, a quieter one. She submitted an anonymous note to the newsletter that used the word harm. Maybe she gained something from writing it. I hope she did. Even now, I hope she did. Sophia came out to the backyard while I was reading this over, the whole of it beginning to end at the kitchen table, and she asked what I was doing. I said I was finishing something. She looked over my shoulder at the screen, reading a line here and there. Then she said, "Dad, are you going to put the tire swing in that?" I said I already had. She said, "Good." She went back inside. The tire swing was moving gently in the yard behind her. The oaks were green. The stumps were settling into the soil. The afternoon was ordinary and full and ours. The neighborhood is quiet in the way good things are quiet. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of something that doesn't need to be loud because it is working. The HOA bulletin board has a notice about the pool closing date and a flyer for a Halloween block party and someone's lost tabby named Biscuit. The community garden is winding down for winter. The oaks are holding their leaves a little longer than the other trees this year, which Irene says white oaks do. Holding on, leaning into the light, taking every last bit of the season before they let go. I find this very relatable. Maya is painting the autumn version of the Neighborhood series. She is working on the oaks specifically, the way the leaves turn in October, a deep burnished gold that I had not known the species produced and that surprised me the first fall after planting. She says she's been trying to capture the way the gold looks different here, in this yard, against the white of Linda's fence in the background, than it would anywhere else. She says the context changes the color. She says all color is relational. She says this is why she paints places rather than abstract forms. Because the relationship between things is where the meaning lives. I am staying here. Maya is staying here. Sophia will grow up here and leave when it's time, the way young things eventually leave the places that grew them, and the place will remember her in the way places remember the people who were young in them. The oaks will be bigger when she visits. The heron will still be at the lake. Tom will probably still be running the HOA with increasing competence and decreasing patience for his failed vegetable garden. Patricia will still have her tomatoes. The plaque will still say what it says. The binder will still be on the shelf. And I will be here at this kitchen table in this house on this land, watching the light change through oak leaves that are getting, slowly and stubbornly, exactly like they used to be. The last thing Linda did that I know of in this neighborhood was plant a rosebush along the inside of her new fence, on her side of the correct boundary line. I saw it going in from my upstairs window one Saturday morning in May. A climbing rose, crimson, already showing its first blooms. I watched the person from the nursery set it carefully into the soil and I thought, she is also planting something. She is also, in her way, trying to grow something back. Maybe that is what all of us do eventually, after the fights are over and the settlements are signed and the elections are done. We go back to the soil. We plant. We wait for what comes up. It is the oldest and most human instinct there is. The last conversation I had with Tom about Linda was brief. He said, she asked about getting involved in the community garden next spring. I said, what did you tell her? He said, I told her the sign-up sheet goes out in February and everyone is welcome. I said, that's right. He said, yeah. We were quiet for a moment. Then he said, you okay with that? I thought about the fence line, the oaks, the sworn acknowledgement, the anonymous note, the forwarded mail, the rosebush. I thought about Sophia saying maybe it's enough. I said, yeah, I'm okay with that. In the spring, when the sign-up sheet went out and 14 households claimed their plots, there was one name at the bottom of the list, written in familiar, precise handwriting. L. Marsh. Plot 15. The plot is in the northeast corner, near the lake, where the light is good in the afternoon. I saw the list when Tom posted it in the chat. I looked at the name for a long moment. Then I scrolled past it to the other names, the Garcias and Pattersons and Janet and the new family on Birch Court and the woman who wasn't afraid to move here and Sophia, who had signed up for a plot of her own. All of us going back to the soil. All of us planting. The END.